Let's see. I get stuff done for you. I think I see it.
Just say they're all big, but you can borrow my pants. Can we tell folks that we're about to start? I know.
I don't care if they hear me.
Just rallying folks from the food to come on in for the main event. Not that the food's not great, but this is kind of the point. Some of you are like, yeah, but there's beer later. That's the point. I get it. All right, let's get started. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Okay. So thank you for coming to the 6th annual Hack the Capitol. This was an idea that I had a few years ago. So I co-founded a 501c3 nonprofit called the ICS Village with Tom Van Norman. Can you tell who does the tech side? And we have a mission of advocacy and education and training on critical infrastructure security. And we have been mainstays at DEF CON with the ICS Village for 13, 14 years. We have been at RSA actually longer than they have the sandbox. So for those of you who aren't aware, there's a sandbox, not the innovation sandbox. There's actually another sandbox where the villages are. And we've been there pushing critical infrastructure education since 2015. And we have been around the world. We have been doing conferences around the United States. And it occurred to me, why don't we talk to the people here in Washington, D.C.? Isn't this kind of an important crowd? Members of Congress, staffers, think tanks, the folks who can pass regulations that could be good or not good. I know everyone's surprised the US government can do something that's not good. Who knew? And so that's where we brought this together. And the point of this conference is not the great content that we have. The purpose of this conference is to facilitate the relationships and the conversation. The panels, the talks that are here throughout the next 2 days are there to bring out elements of it, but it is the relationships that you build here with each other that's what matters the rest of this year. We talk about training in peace so you bleed less in war. Well, the same thing applies where the first time to build a relationship is not when you need help, not when you're in the middle of an incident, trying to understand how do I get through it. And it's the relationships that you can build at conferences like this that enable that. And so that is what I would really treat each of you is, again, attend the talks, but a lot of what we facilitated between the meeting room, the banquet we're holding later, is the opportunity to meet each other, discuss, and to start to build those relationships, because it's the discussions that happen outside of this building that are going to make a difference. Of course, this cannot be done without the generous support of numerous folks. The first, I'd like to give a round of applause to MITRE for helping host us and bring this together. Google, who you might have noticed a lot of Google pieces in there, was a tremendous sponsor and really bringing this together this year, along with Dragos, Industrial Defender, Accenture Federal Services, Booz Allen Hamilton, the Edison Electric Institute, Grimm, Scythe, and Cutaway Security. We also just, because for those of you going, wow, I really like the 1970s theme, and I want to help give back to the nonprofit that does this. We just published a link for you to be able to buy t-shirt swag off of the website, icsvillage.com. So that is a small way to help promote us. So I'm not going to give you the importance of critical infrastructure. You're here because you already understand that. You don't need me to quote that ransomware continues to be a problem, that entire cities like Dallas recently have gone down. The news and your presence already tells me you understand that. But what is the mission? Has anybody ever heard of a Security Champions program? No? Okay, perfect example of why we need security champions. You are security champions. In an enterprise environment with IT and OT, security champions are the fact that security does not need to go this mission alone. We don't need to be just the culture of no, the culture of checklist and you need to do these things. We need folks who are in operations, who are in those business functions, to understand and to be there when we can't be, to help bring the mission of security inside. It's almost like counterinsurgency, only this one is one of ideas. And so I empower each of you to be security champions for the community. It's not us in the room that needs to get this. It's the citizenry. It's the government officials. It's everybody else that's affected by all of this that don't understand it. The silver lining, if there is one, right, in every catastrophe there's opportunity, is the fact, and unfortunately we continue to learn this backwards, right? It's like we know there's going to be a problem. We, the experts, all go, there's a problem, and then it happens, and we're like, we told you so, but it still happened. And that's the silver lining in Colonial Pipeline. So the phrase that I've been speaking about since that is I call it that Colonial Pipeline turned ransomware into a kitchen word. And what I mean by that is when you can talk to your grandmother, who still asks you how to turn on her iPhone, and she says, I know what ransomware is, that's a change. Well, the same silver lining with Colonial Pipeline ties to that is the kitchen word for understanding industrial control systems and ringtones. Please mute your phones. Turning that into a kitchen word where you, again, as security champions, there's a nugget of understanding now. These problems are no longer just on the front pages. They're in all of our communities. And they branch beyond just being an American problem. This is a world problem. We certainly have issues with some other folks in this world. But when it comes down to innocent civilians, that's what critical infrastructure supports. And nobody should be denied access to clean water or electricity to live their life. And so I empower you as security champions to go, again, don't speak nerd, learn to speak the language of those who are trying to help and understand so that we can help them. Orienting you, because you might have noticed this place is a bit of a labyrinth, and if you haven't, you're about to discover it. So you are in track 1. Track 2 and 3, let me see if I get this right. Track 3 is right around there. Where's track 2, Beth? Also around there. See, I'm already lost, confused, and I've walked like 5 times. We have signs up. We have lots of folks who are happy to help you. So the lemming approach will work. So 2 and 3 are out there with different tracks. Special this year is tracks 1 and 2 are televised. We have probably between 700 and 1,000 people watching this online. We were physically limited in what we could do in person. So there's a set number to who can be here. And track 3 is from a professional organization called the Beer ISAC. And this was stood up a number of years ago by Patrick Miller and Chris Sistrunk, with the idea being is there's a number of us who are security champions in the industrial control system space, and we are here to work amongst ourselves as a community to help each other. And so we have an entire track, and it's not recorded. It is Chatham House rules only. And the idea is it's a very small classroom style. So where most of this stuff is high level and policy focused, the Beer ISAC track is intentionally, let's get deep, let's talk about the problems, and it's only amongst those in the room. The hangout room, of course, like we talked about for hanging hanging out. We have an Enigma machine brought down by the National Cryptologic Center. And then the ICS Village, we are one of several villages that all look at different disciplines in this space who have been, these are hacker passion projects. We've all had different levels of maturity in doing this. And at the end of the day, it is a deep dive with someone who's willing to give you a hands-on understanding of that piece. So back down past the cafeteria are numerous villages. We have the biohacking village. Grim is running a city attack village. We have MITRE. We have the lockpicking village, so you can get your hands on lockpicking, and the aerospace village. I think I got them all. Did I miss anybody? Okay. So go and check out those. We're going to continue to look in future years how to make those even more prominent. And XR Village is a new village that is inside of Track 3. And then we have signups in the hangout room for MITRE lab tours, the escape room. So for those of you who haven't seen the escape room, that is a collaborative effort between INL and CISA. This is a new debut. So they have taken it version 2. It's being debuted today. Signups are in there. They are size limited, so recommend you do sign up. And those are past the villages, down a set of stairs, and it looks like you're going to be taken to Guantanamo, but I promise at the end of the hallway is the escape room and DOE's cyber strike. So this is our first year doing it this way. We moved out of the Beltway. We moved to a bigger location. We're not afraid to experiment as a nonprofit with finding the best ways to do this. So I welcome your feedback on, again, just as the same as you as security champions are going to go and help the community in the world, help us do this better together too. Thank you. I think I'm supposed to introduce you. Oh. You get a formal introduction. Yeah, I can even stand behind the podium too. All right. Charles Clancy is a senior vice president at MITRE. Doesn't he look senior vice president-ish? I've known Charles for a while. And heads MITRE Labs. Over 4,000 MITRE Lab scientists, technologists, and engineers deliver deeply technical capabilities and solutions to the 6 federally funded R&D centers MITRE operates on behalf of the US government. They also serve the MITRE's other federal, nonprofit, and private sector customers. In addition, Charles serves as MITRE's chief futurist. I want that title.
Nothing's stopping you, right?
Do you have a crystal ball in your office?
Not yet.
You should. I'm going to get you one.
Okay.
Working to realize a future where emerging technology is democratic, sustainable, and equitable. Charles?
All right, thank you. Well, MITRE is thrilled to be hosting Hack the Capitol. I know I have attended prior incarnations of this event that Bryson's hosted, and it's really exciting to have everyone here. And please feel free to reach out to any of the MITRE staff if you have any questions about any of the logistics. Hearing all the different rooms involved, I know it can be a little bit difficult to find all the different spots where I think we'll be hosting different facets of this event. As Bryson mentioned, MITRE operates 6 federally funded research and development centers. So we are a nonprofit chartered in the public interest, and our core mission is serving as the operator of these R&D centers. And cybersecurity is really one of the key themes that cuts across all of them. Certainly the work that we do for the Department of Defense and intelligence community has strong cybersecurity ties, but we also operate an FFRDC for DHS, where CISA is the primary customer, and we operate the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence as a public-private partnership with NIST, working on cyber standards. So across MITRE, we have about 1,500 cyber professionals, and it's about 20% of our technical staff are working in cybersecurity. So this is something that we really take seriously, and we're great to have this connectivity to the broader community. I think, of course, everyone coming together today, we all, I think, feel a sense of urgency around the role of critical infrastructure in our cybersecurity ecosystem. Each year, the DNI presents their worldwide threat assessment, and each year, cyber threats to critical infrastructure from Russia and China are at the top of that list. We know that China is pursuing access into our critical infrastructure systems, in our electric power infrastructure and our rail infrastructure, specifically to disrupt our system, our ability to respond, our ability to project military force. And these are serious concerns, right? I'd say cybersecurity has been elevated from a sort of a tactical tool of warfare to one of strategic effect. And we're seeing national governments really realign how they think about cybersecurity, attack, and defense through this lens. So I think that really brings some urgency to the work that we're doing here, and I think the conversations that we're going to have over the next couple days. Here at MITRE, I think we're taking what we call a whole-of-nation approach to cybersecurity. So we're very interested in how we can connect the needs of the U.S. federal government with the needs of industry, with the needs of academia, with the nonprofit world, because it really takes integrating across all of these different facets for us to be able to put together a systematic defense. Certainly, many of you are probably familiar with MITRE from our role in developing and maintaining a number of the sort of marquee brands in cyber, including CVE, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and certainly as industrial control and OT system and ICS becomes increasingly important, we're always thinking about how to expand our capabilities in those platforms to support some of the unique aspects of OT and ICS. So a few years ago, we released ATT&CK for ICS, and we're grateful to many of the folks who are in the room who are participating in sharing adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures so that we can continue to mature and evolve ATT&CK for ICS as the threat landscape continues to change. We're also thinking a lot about some of our red team emulation tools, systems like Caldera, on how we can continue to mature the capabilities within Caldera to support red team emulation in the OT space. So please feel free to reach out to us and engage. We're looking for feedback on how we can continue to mature those capabilities, really on behalf of the whole cybersecurity industry, and bring really the best to bear in this whole of nation approach. Of course, no event in the Washington, D.C. bubble this week would be complete without mentioning large language models. I think I've been to 2 events in the last week where actually Jen Easterly, who's going to be giving our keynote, has talked about large language models. So be sure to ask her questions about it. She has lots of opinions about the role of LLMs. But it's also something that I see as having a pretty significant impact on the cybersecurity domain, right? I think we're already starting to see how you might imagine a chatbot co-pilot for conducting cyber operations. And that really changing the landscape in terms of who can execute a successful cyber operation against a complex target, right? Imagine an LLM that's able to ingest network metadata, specifications about equipment, and really be able to serve as that co-pilot recommending courses of action either to an attacker or a defender, right? So as polishing my crystal ball that Bryson has now promised me, I predict that by the end of the year, we're going to see ChatGPT-enabled cyber operations tools, both for attack and defense. So it's kind of an interesting time for both the AI community and the impacts that that's going to have on the cybersecurity community as you think about new technologies evolving the scope and scale of cyber attacks. So with that, I guess I would like to hand the mic back over to Bryson so that he can introduce our keynote speaker. Oh, no?
Sure, I got it.
You got it.
Gives it a real improv kind of feel, doesn't it? Jen Easterly is the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So secure, it's in the title twice. She's a proud mom, a mental health advocate, a Rubik's Cube enthusiast. I feel like we need to add llama corn in there somehow. And an aspiring electric guitarist. Before joining CISA, Jen led the firm-wide resilience effort at Morgan Stanley after a lengthy public service career that included serving at the White House twice, helping to stand up the Army's first cyber battalion, and more than 20 years of service in intelligence and cyber operations, including tours of duty in Haiti, the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I think you have to really show off that we have the actual
my spirit animal.
The spirit animal.
You're dressed so conservatively. What's the deal?
So
I'm going to dress up because I'm going to like be half as cool as Bryson, and then you show up like.
So here's what I'm going to offer. Just like I did TLP red pants with Chris.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a pair of dragon pants.
Okay.
And you and I are going to do TLP dragon pants together at the next event. You all heard it. I guarantee it.
With my.
I have no idea what these are going to look like if they even come in men's sizes, but I will wear them however it works.
I will help you. I will help you. Awesome.
This is not beer. This is apparently water.
Yeah. Okay.
And the last time I was here at MITRE, they actually informed me I wasn't allowed to spit on the audience. That's a true story.
Or spin on me, hopefully.
I actually like to project that way for entertainment.
Okay, all right.
VIPs, I like to come back. The audience, yeah, it's more like cogs in a wheel.
That's why you put the reporters up front. Is that
Not touching that one.
Yeah, okay.
So, first of all, again, thank you and welcome back for coming to speak here. And so how has your tenure gone versus your expectations coming into the role as the director of CISA?
CISA?
CISA.
First of all, it's great to be here. We did this last year, and I went back and I looked at the transcript from our talk at Hack Capital. I wasn't in person, but it's been a long year. It's been a long 2 years, actually. It's an interesting question on expectations because I'd never been in the Department of Homeland Security before. I spent my career, really the bulk of my career, 21 years in the Army, so in uniform, around the world, several times downrange in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in the White House, where you're stuck in the White House Situation Room doing policy. I was at the NSA, where you're largely in a skiff doing intelligence, foreign intelligence. And so it was kind of cool to come to a place that was completely different, but I didn't have a ton of expectations because, of course, when I left government at the end of 2016, there was no CISA. There was something called NPPD that nobody really knew what it stood for or what they did. And I think one of the smartest things that Suzanne Spalding did was help to, along with Chris, help get that into legislation. I think that, there was a lot in a name that makes a difference, whether you have two securities in there or CISA or CISA or whatever. But so the thing that has been the most cool is the fact that this is such an external facing agency. As you know, we're not a traditional regulator. We're not a military agency. We're not an intel agency. We're not a law enforcement agency. We're a voluntary partnership agency that works closely with the private sector, with international partners, with state and local partners. And the magic is really in how do we create trust with our partners based on the talent and the expertise that we have and the ingenuity and the innovation in terms of the kind of services and capabilities that we can provide. And so the ability to get out and to meet with state and local officials, particularly election officials, since we serve as the sector risk management agency for election infrastructure, to work with small businesses that, after all, are the engine of our economy, right? 99.9% of businesses in the US are small businesses with, I think, a median size of 11. So the small business community, the target-rich cyber poor, I think I saw Corman out there somewhere, the target-rich cyber poor community, the hospitals and the K-12 schools and the municipal water facilities, to really understand how they do business and what they invest in their security and where we can add value to their mission. And frankly, the funnest part of this job is getting out to the field. Last week, I was meeting with the Secretary of State of Tennessee and the Homeland Security Advisor, and then meeting with students at Vanderbilt, because you really get to understand where the challenges are and where you can most effectively meet those challenges. So, if I had to choose between the White House Sit Room and Nashville, Tennessee, I'd pick Nashville, Tennessee any day.
So when you're talking about how many businesses there are in the United States, this is something I've covered in a lot of my talks. There are 32 million businesses, and as you noted, the size. And I think, again, when we look at this room, this isn't the room that doesn't understand the core problem. Again, as I challenged you in my talk, you're the security champions to go and educate those who don't understand. And it's really easy to be, when we look in the echo chamber of our expertise, to go, well, why doesn't everyone else not understand this? And when you think about a business of 11, they barely understand the computers that they have. They don't consider the fact that there's an interdependency of water and electricity on the way their business functions. You tie this into these pieces. I mean, one of my talks, I talked about how many companies do you think even have access to a red team, right? A red team is the ability to emulate the threat, because a threat is what defines security. And I guess, because nobody knows this, is I guess there's maybe a couple thousand of all of the companies in the United States who have access to that level of capability. You kind of walk that back and you start to see a lowering of what is accessible to them.
Yeah.
So What are you proud that CISA, is it CISA or CISA? And I've been
I would-
corrected multiple times, and I heard you
Yeah.
gave me permission to say it both ways.
To be totally honest, I had to be educated on this when I took over. So there's a little sort of, I think something on Twitter about, how do you pronounce it? And it's CISA.
It's CISA.
It is CISA.
Is that one of those things where they prepped you in the confirmation hearing? Because like some member of Congress is gonna be like, you don't pronounce it
I
correctly.
think they did actually, to be honest with you. What am I most proud of? Well, I guess I'm a lot of things, frankly. First, the most important thing is the people. And I think we have some amazing people, some of whom are here and some of whom I think are speaking at Hack the Capitol. And we've also been able to bring on some amazing talent. Using some innovative new ways to do it. Earlier this week, we announced our Cyber Innovation Fellows program, which enables private sector folks to come in and work with us a couple days a week to help us solve tough problems based on their expertise. And they also get to understand who we are, what we do, how we can add value, and to help us get better. So Chris Hughes joined us from Acquia, where he's the Chief Information Security Officer, Michelle Hook from CLS Group, and we're bringing in more of these folks. And it's a first of its kind program, so figuring out how to slay the dragons of bureaucracy. That's really why I like the dragon pants, because it's all about how do we kill the bureaucracy. But we've hired, I think, about 516 people last year. We are on pace to exceed that. We're using our new cyber talent management system authorities to put in place. I think we're moving towards 100 people, which is not a ton, but the quality that we've been able to bring in on that program, folks like Jack Cable, folks like Grant Dasher. We've brought in, fantastic people who are just great thought leaders in this space, with some exciting people who are going to be joining in the next few weeks. So I'm excited about that. I think the key to recruiting great talent, though, is the culture that you build. And we spent a lot of time when I came on board figuring out how to co-create that culture. What do we want to be, right? What are our values? Collaboration, innovation, service to the nation, accountability to the American people, and the core principles that underpin that. What are the behaviors we expect from each other and what we aspire to be as an organization? Because if you don't have great culture, and you know this from the Army, if you don't have that organizational identity that is underpinned by a strong culture of excellence, you're not going to be able to recruit and have a talent management ecosystem that is successful. And so I'm excited about that and proud of that, because that's really something that we've co-created with our workforce. I think the partnerships are in a great place. I was excited that the Congress gave us the authorities to stand up the Joint Cyber Planning Office, which we of course called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. We are continuing to build that and evolve that and make that successful. I think one of the things that gets a little bit lost is how transformational that is, how we're really trying to shift the paradigm from decades of public-private partnerships, which frankly were episodic and unidirectional and not necessarily the right type of mechanism that we needed to defend the country. And the idea was we wanted to bring together the federal cyber ecosystem on one platform for cyber defense planning and operations and information fusion. So that's CISA, NSA, FBI, Cybercom, the sector risk management agencies, with the private sector, with international partners, with state and local partners, to come together to create a tapestry of visibility that would allow us to better understand the threat so we could drive down risk to the nation. That's a really hard thing to do because it's based on one 5-letter word, which is trust, right? And so you're trying to get to a default to share where everybody realizes, to your point about small businesses, a threat to one is a threat to many, given that we're so connected and we're so digitized, we're very vulnerable. Where there's co-equal partnership between government and industry in particular, so you have reciprocal expectations of transparency and responsiveness and value added. And where industry doesn't have to fear punitive sanction if they're sharing information. And then finally, where you're making that interaction as frictionless as possible. And so finding those shared platforms, whether it's Slack or whether it's the new analytic platforms that we're ultimately building with the joint collaborative environment. So I think that that's going well, frankly, but it's transformational. And so we're going to continue to build. We started out with 10 companies. We're now up to over almost 240. And that's not 240 acting together at the same time. It's usually the work that we do, the defense planning, the plans that we do. It's usually sort of 20 companies at a time. So the ICS work that we did with the vendors that we announced at S4 last year, along with the big pipeline companies, that was 25 to work together on how do we plan against major attacks against operational technology infrastructure. And so I think it's going well. Always more work to do, and we always welcome feedback as a gift. So it's transformative. The last thing I'll say, I just came from another talk with a group of CEOs, and several of them mentioned just the cohesion across the U.S. government, which I'm also really proud of, is, you know, the work from the White House with Anne and Chris, now Kemba, to all the operational agencies with Paul and Rob, and now Nate at the State Department, and Brian Vordran at FBI, and Eric Goldstein. We really work together well as a team. And I think that really makes a difference, particularly when you're facing off to the private sector and they want to be able to know that the government is speaking with a coherent voice. Things like the Operation Medusa that was announced and then backstopped by a jointly sealed cybersecurity advisory on snake malware. I think you've seen a lot of this joint work, and you'll see more of it.
The interconnectivity and the small business aspect reminded me of one of my favorite stories I love to tell every time, because it illustrates two parts. One, the interdependencies of these systems that we don't think about, and the creativity of the threat. And in 2014, it was the breach of the Sands Hotel, which cost them tens of millions of dollars. And the story is the hotel magnate, Sheldon Adelson, he made some comments about the Iranians, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard said, we're going to do something about that.
Yep.
Well, the Sands Hotel, being a casino with, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars at stake, had good security. However, they depended on a small business because they had a multi-million-dollar fish tank. Now, I don't know anything about multi-million-dollar fish tanks, but I'm guessing you don't have one dude sitting there doing this to make sure that your millions of dollars of fish are okay.
Right.
You have sensors going to probably what was a 3-person company of Bubba's who are the best at taking care of fish. And the Iranians found that link. And the first part is recognizing the interdependency. I'm pretty sure nobody considered in their threat model that the sensors in the fish tank probably shouldn't talk to the core financial functions. And it's not that they did directly, but it was one of those things that I have an RF bridge that's now available. And they found this, and they were able to use that literally coming in through the fish tank to cause all of this damage. And so that system thinking is so much a challenge in this. Is you can have Fort Knox, you can be JP Morgan, but your supply chain and all of those 11-person companies that you depend on for all of these little pieces, including services and functions you don't think of as critical, is part of the access and impact, and is the creativity of where the threat's going. And so throwing a little bit of, bringing the last question that you know of, but tying it back into JCDC, because I think that is one of the more public signature programs that you've had. What is the vision of where that goes, right? It grew from this, it has expanded. You've already talked about the fact that having 240 people, you know, organizations is not trying to have 240 people in a room, because you can't build trust that way. There's not common ground, and you get noise. So you're going to grow this bigger. What's that end vision of what that looks like?
Yeah. So the near-term work that we're doing around that is to ensure that this is not a CISA thing. It's not a government thing. It really is something where we are working closely with the private sector, with international partners, with state and local, on what collectively we believe the most difficult problems are to the nation. And so we do a lot of feedback sessions. We did listening sessions at RSA. We did the analytics session in Nashville to constantly hear about their vision for where we need to go. So all of which to say, you know, I have a vision, but this is frankly has to be a collective defense vision where we're in these constant feedback, feed forward loops on how to build something that's the right platform for the nation. for this year, we gathered our partners and we developed the JCDC planning agenda focused around what we thought were the biggest problems we were dealing with. Water, as you know, really big issue. Focus on energy, focus on open source software, threats to industrial control systems, so a project on that. And then we're rewriting the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, which we were assigned to do by the National Cyber Strategy. And then, very interestingly, we have something that I'm really excited that we're taking on. It's not necessarily critical infrastructure, but it's on high-risk communities. And so civil society, and then something that's really near and dear to me, given all the work I did on hostage policy, journalists, but also researchers, people who are vulnerable to things like Pegasus and spyware. So using some of our JCDC technology companies, working with civil society and working with the amazing people on our Technology Advisory Council under Jeff Moss's leadership, people like Runa Sandvik, people like Rachel Toback, Dina Daidzovi, working with them to figure out how do we understand the threat, and then can we help to put in place things that can help these high-risk communities. And we announced that at the Summit for the Democracy a couple weeks ago. And so the things that we've really changed is to make sure that this is a collective vision. We also changed how you become a member. And so it's just really signing this agreement and you're a member of the JCDC. You may work on certain cyber defense planning and projects. You may be in a small Slack channel sharing information on a specific threat, or you may just benefit from the type of products that we're putting out, and you may help us enrich them based on your research, based on your visibility. And so we're continuing to evolve it. But what I'm really trying to get to was somewhat in the article that Eric Goldstein and I worked on, and that's this idea of persistent operational collaboration, where the default is to share, where it's collaboration over self-preservation, where you have co-equal partnership, where it's responsive, transparent, value-added, and where you have a frictionless experience. So that's the vision. I think it will take a while to get there, but we've got terrific partners across the government. We're working with the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which focuses specifically on the DIB, as they're the DoD is the SRMA for the DIB. And we just, for some of you who may have been out at RSA, we just did a great presentation with Joe Hartman of Cybercom on how we're thinking about what we call the offense-defense flywheel. And that's how what they see in red space, or what they see from some of their hunting operations, can inform the work that we're doing to defend critical infrastructure. And so, we're trying to not be tied necessarily to a certain, we've got to get there, but we are at the same time trying to be disciplined about the vision and end state that we're trying to achieve. And again, it's transformational, so it's not always easy. But, and by the way, I'm sure we've got folks in this room who have opinions on things. We always treat constructive feedback as a gift. So help us make this better, because we really want to do it, certainly not for CISA or the federal government, but for the nation. I think you've been a great help on this.
No, I was wondering if they all noticed that. You're like, constructive feedback.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's me. Hi.
It's very constructive.
So going to the article that you wrote with Eric Goldstein, how does secure by design, which I think traditionally most folks look at software and hardware for consumer electronics, because we're going to hell in a handbasket with IoT as a society, in enterprise, but how does that specifically apply to critical infrastructure?
Yeah. It's interesting. We might have talked about this last year, but when you talk about critical infrastructure, and our mission at CISA is, of course, to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the critical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And, when you say critical infrastructure, people think it's this very technical term, and it's those guys that manage critical infrastructure, but it's just the water, right? The power, the energy, how we get money from the ATM, how we get gas from the pump, where we get our education, our healthcare. It's everything that we rely upon. And oh, by the way, it's now all underpinned by a technology base. It's all powered by software. It's all largely digitized and is getting more and more digitized as cities across the world become smarter and smarter, right? And so we often talk about, cyber people love to talk about the threat and all these exotic names, and now they're becoming even more exotic, I think. But and it is interesting in me, and you're, as a former Intel officer, that is, it's fascinating. But like Dmitry, our friend Dmitry Alperovitch talks about, we don't have a cyber problem. We have a Russia, China, North Korea, Iran problem. What Eric and I talked about is we don't have a cyber problem. We have a technology and culture problem. Because at the end of the day, we have allowed speed to market and features to really put safety and security in the back seat for technology, whether it's information technology or operational technology. And frankly, I think that is the only way that we are going to catalyze a sustainable approach, so that we're not in this space talking about how many attacks did we have this year, and it's 8.5 trillion, then it's 10.5 trillion, and this is our losses. And I think it's the only way to get ahead of it is to push it as far to the left as possible, so that technology manufacturers, software providers who are trillion-dollar companies at the end of the day are actually bearing a much greater burden, right? They're owning the outcomes of security, which means that they're developing technology that's secure by design, meaning that they're tested and developed to reduce vulnerabilities as much as possible. It's not going to go to zero, but frankly, you can drive that down instead of expecting that every month we will publish those vulnerabilities that need to be patched, right? And just expecting people to get on the patch right away. I worked at Morgan Stanley for 4.5 years. It's not a trivial thing to patch infrastructure. It can be complicated. It can take a while. There are risk decisions. You want to make sure nothing affects the opening business in Asia in the morning. So they need to bear that burden. That's sort of first part of the piece. But also secure by default. So basic security controls like MFA, like password complexity, baked into the technology. So we don't have to bolt it on. I mean, the multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry was really as a result of the fact of the misaligned incentives, because technology was always about how do we get speed to market? How do we get features in? And so if you look at sort of the short history, Bryson, of the internet, started out, let's call it 1983, the birth of the internet, when TCP/IP was implemented to allow computers to talk to each other. Security was never even a remote consideration. I mentioned this last week in a talk at Vanderbilt, where I pulled from the late great security researcher Dan Kaminsky, who said, the internet was never designed to be secure. The internet was designed to move pictures of cats. And we're very good at moving pictures of cats. So you had an internet full of viruses, you had software full of vulnerabilities, you had social media full of disinformation, and now we have AI full of hallucinations. But sort of like an infantry lieutenant, frequently wrong, never in doubt. So I think we need to be very, very mindful of making some of the mistakes with artificial intelligence that we've made with technology. But just going back to the case, at the end of the day, everything's underpinned by technology to include critical infrastructure. And so ensuring that it is safe as possible when it comes off the line is incredibly important. And we are together with our international partners, the Brits, the Canadians, the Dutch, the Germans, the Australians, the New Zealand. We've published with NSA, with FBI, principles and approaches to secure by design, secure by default. Bob Lord, who is one of our senior technical advisors, is one of the thought leaders, along with Jack Cable and Grant Dasher and Eric. And that's that document that went out to start that conversation. They would tell you it's sort of the preface, the prologue, and there's going to be a series of chapters so that we can get the market signal out on this, because that's the only way we're going to start to move the ball. Yes, there may be a regulatory answer, there may be a liability answer, but at the end of the day, there has never been this market signal. It's not that these software companies don't want to create safe products. They absolutely do. I mean, I've had very recent conversations with Microsoft, with Google, with Amazon. They do, and people want safe products. Oftentimes, there's just not the transparency to know what to ask for. And so if you look at that document, and I hope everybody does, principles are not techie, they're business. Technology producers and manufacturers should own the security outcomes of their customers. We should have radical transparency in what security is, a roadmap for memory safe code, a roadmap for enterprise MFA. And businesses should be organized at the top level to put priority on safety and security. That doesn't mean you can't have innovation. You can have innovation. You just can't think about it as innovation or is incompatible with security and safety. And that's really part of an important conversation with artificial intelligence, frankly. So these are, I think, the most important conversations to have to get to a more sustainable approach, is to solve the technology and culture problem, to solve our cyber problem.
I think in there is the harsh recognition that whether the risk or the cost, it's just been transferred. We as society pay the cost of a manufacturer who designs and sells something within that. Something else that I like to talk about a lot, and since you brought it up with TCP/IP in 1983, the internet is 40 years old. Firewalls roughly became commonplace at 2000. So the idea that your network is different from your network is different from my network is effectively 20 years old. And then Target in 2012 was the first time that business writ large said we should have more than AV and firewalls to defend ourselves. It's not that it didn't exist, but again, it wasn't common spread. The existence of the modern cybersecurity ecosystem is roughly 10 years old. The full quote that I wasn't given in that one article was where I was trying to highlight the challenge for CISA. You are a few years old. You are responsible for all of this critical infrastructure. I mean, picking on another agency who was speaking later, which was the RSA panel that I hosted with them last year, between two Tims, with TSA, where I joked, nobody knew they were in charge of ONG, including TSA, when Colonial happened. That's not the joke is they did, of course, but they weren't funded for it. Yeah. And I think we forget a lot of that is at the end of the day, an agency can only do what it's funded, and then actually the time it takes to put the funding in play. Exactly. And then the final piece to secure by default, I think Star Wars illustrates this well. I'm sorry, for quiet by default is also a good one. Secure by default, where literally every time we want to break through technology, we just take a blaster and shoot the door lock and it opens. That is not secure by default, right? And that's the same mistake we make here. So are we managing critical infrastructure well as a country? What else could we be doing?
Yes, it's a great question. It's
you
a
can just
great
like,
question.
yes, done.
Yes, done. But it's interesting, right? Because when you talk about the short history of CISA, of the internet, of cybersecurity, and you think about how to make some of this transformational change. So, I think of secure by design and sort of a bumper sticker as unsafe at any CPU speed. Mm-hmm. So you think about Ralph Nader's book in 1965, Unsafe at Any Speed. And then it wasn't, frankly, until 83 that I think seatbelts, which is really the, MFA is the seatbelt of the information superhighway, where they became mandatory. And you wouldn't buy a car today without seatbelts and airbags and anti-lock brakes and crumple zones. So I think this is a bit of evolution in culture, frankly. But, you're right. We've only really been looking at this problem, cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, in a coherent way for, maybe a couple decades. We had, of course, Executive Order 13636 back in 2013 during the Obama administration. We had PPD 21, which is now 10 years old. We're in the process of rewriting that. I think the good news is, so over the last 5 years, so we have a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that, based on legislation, based on the NDAA in 2021, well, first, based on our statutory legislation, was made the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience. So our job is to work with the rest of the sector risk management agencies, which was in the 2021 NDA, to ensure that we are able to reduce cross-sector risk. And the NDAA laid out 6 functions. We serve as an SRMA for 8 sectors, 1 subsector, and importantly, as the national coordinator, which is sort of working with Treasury, with energy, with TSA, with healthcare, to ensure that we are together able to reduce risk. And they bring that technical expertise, but they're not expected to bring huge cyber expertise. They understand how the operational technology and pipelines work, or how hospitals need to use technology to help keep their systems secure. But at the end of the day, we really take on that role. And you're right, we are young, we are growing. I think Some of the monies that we got recently with the infrastructure bill allowed us to create our sector risk management agency governance structure. So we have more reps who are experts in things like water and healthcare. We now just rejuvenated the Federal Senior Leadership Council, which I chair and operationally led by Brandon Wales and Elena Clark on my team that has reps from all of the SRMAs. We're working closely with the White House on the rewrite for PPD 21. We have a draft of the national plan that will go shortly after PPD 21 is done. We have to do all the sector specific plans, but we've gotten ahead of all of those by working with sectors to do the sector planning initiative, which will really be the update to the sector specific plans. We're looking at how we can assess sectors, whether we still need certain sectors, whether we want to add a sector like space or something else. So these are ongoing conversations. I think what I'm saying is the infrastructure for governance has evolved and will continue to evolve. I think the awareness of the importance of securing a critical infrastructure has evolved significantly because of things like Colonial Pipeline. I still think that we remain very vulnerable to significant threats. Russia, I think it was mentioned before, China, which is the one that I worry about the most, because you think about the lessons that we're learning from the Ukraine war, things like the power of defense, the power of resilience, the power of partnership, and you think about what China's learning, that they won't be deterred on going after our critical infrastructure in the same way that Putin has been. So if you just read the intelligence community's annual assessment, it's very explicit on the event of a major conflict. Read China's attempt to annex Taiwan, whether that's a blockade of the Straits or an invasion. China will almost certainly aggressively go after our critical infrastructure here in the homeland, almost certainly has the capability of launching disruptive attacks against rail, against oil and natural gas, to delay military movement and to induce societal panic. And at CISA, in our role as America's Cyber Defense Agency, as the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience, we are motivated by a sense of urgency every single day to ensure we have the right trusted partnerships in place to enable us to detect, to respond, recover. We know this is likely to happen. So how do we make sure that it's not about prevention anymore? How are we resilient? Both resilient from a cyber perspective, resilient from an operational and functional perspective. How are we resilient from a societal perspective? I mean, Ukraine is the shining example of that. The barbaric attacks that we've seen against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and the unity, the fact that the Ukrainian people continue to be unified, to continue to resist, continue to fight on to victory, I think is a really important lesson learned in societal resilience. Because if you look at the reaction to Colonial Pipeline, if you look at the reaction to the high altitude balloons, you don't take away that America as the global superpower is resilient as a society. And so I think we have much to do there. I think the things we laid out in the article of safe technology, persistent operational collaboration, and corporate cyber responsibility can all help advance greater security and critical infrastructure, but some of this is a cultural issue.
And so a lot of the focus goes to the haves. They have the resources to engage. They have the budget that attracts vendors. But it's the have-nots, right? The cyber poor that need our help. And you coalesced those priorities this year with healthcare, water, and education. So why did you pick those, and what's the thinking there?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm also excited about is the growth of our field force. So over the past couple of years, I mean, we've almost doubled the size of the agency over the past few years, and our budget has doubled over the past several years since we were created. But we've put a lot of those resources into our field forces. So building our cybersecurity advisors, our cybersecurity state coordinators that work with state CISOs and CIOs, and then creating a more integrated structure. So we started out with protective security advisors. This was the legacy of 9/11, much more about physical security. And now we're looking at it from a converged, integrated perspective, integrated security advisors. And so the reason why I chose those sectors is I wanted to give specific priorities that the field could help us engage on. I wanted to choose those entities that were target-rich, cyber poor, that were targeted a lot with things like ransomware. We saw that with hospitals. We see it with K through 12 schools. I'm very worried about water utilities because they're a perfect example of something that's very vulnerable, but doesn't necessarily, because of the way they're structured, how many of these facilities there are, they don't have a lot of resources. We're also focused on local election officials now. We've worked at the state level. We really want to get out to those municipalities, to those towns, to those counties to help them because they're also very cyber poor. And so I wanted to, first of all, figure out how we can make a difference in these sectors, but do it in a way where it's not just measuring activities, but actually measuring outcomes. You know, the big question in cyber is how do you actually measure reduction of risk? Which is hard because we don't have CERC in place yet. We don't understand the universe of how many events there are. It's all anecdotal. Whatever numbers are out there, whatever studies are out there from whatever vendor, it's all really just a guess right now. And so, you know, we will be able to, I hope, get a better read on that after cyber incident reporting goes into effect. But right now, using tools like the cybersecurity performance goals, using the free services that we provide, that our industry partners provide, they did pages and pages of this as part of our Shields Up campaign. We're trying to understand, can we help a school district? Can we help a small hospital? Can we help a water facility using the CPGs, using free services, using assessments, using things like our cyber hygiene vulnerability scanning? Can we help them reduce risk? So we're trying to spend a whole year doing this. At the end of the year, see have we been able to make any difference on a really, really hard problem. The last reason I chose it, Bryson, is because for 3 of those sectors, you know, we service the SRMA for elections. It's different SRMAs that are not always as focused on cybersecurity as they have been before, but are getting increasingly so. So it's working with HHS, and our deputy director, Nitin Natarajan, is an HHS alum, and so he's got a great partnership with them that we're working on. In particular, some of the nonprofit hospitals, some of the smaller hospitals. Again, Josh did a lot of work on this problem set when he was at CISA as a senior advisor. We're working with EPA on water, working with Ed on schools. And then I've also actually brought on people onto our advisory board who have expertise. The CEO of Atlantic Healthcare, one of his hospitals, has just dealt with a major ransomware attack. Bob Scott, who's the Public Utility Commission in New Hampshire, cyber advisor to the governor up there. Doug Levin from the nonprofit K-12 6, so to help advise us on cyber in schools. And so really wanted to try and make a dent in a really, really hard problem where people are suffering. You think about hospitals. I think just some reporting came out on this. Schools. I mean, these are places where we really want to make a difference in people who need the help. And so I'm very motivated on that. But I'm interested, we talked about this a little bit. I mean, you're a nonprofit that focuses on this as well. It would be great to ramp up some of our work around this.
Yeah, no, I think our nonprofits claim to fame because we, for a long time, basically toiled in obscurity of the fact that critical infrastructure, right? And that's where I talked about Colonial Pipeline being becoming a kitchen word for ransomware and critical infrastructure. But we had been demonstrating the tactic, and I know it has since been disproven as an insider threat of the water plant hack in Florida. We've been demonstrating that exact attack chain and technique for several years. And so when that happened, all of a sudden everyone looks and goes, oh, who's been talking about and doing that for years? And it was us, and we had been demonstrating that. And so it's the reason we had done this was never for the recognition, but again, for the education and the advocacy. And I think we have a number of successes ourselves that we can point to. We have an MOU with you, Department of Energy, DOD, and the Navy, where we do a lot of different collaborative work, and I look forward to collaborating even further to take this again. The Escape Room and Cyber Strike that are here and at several of our events are an example of that collaboration. But as always, we look to go further. The fact that cybersecurity and the offshoot of operational technology from cybersecurity typically being seen as a 4-year academic degree, we have helped several community colleges implement the beginning of operational technology programs. So You don't have to go do a 4-year degree. You can do 1 year of training and come out doing that. We have some other things with some trade unions, and I don't want to go into the details, but if you look at it just from a trade union and a job perspective, the ability to go from I make $20 to $25 an hour doing this, now understanding that there's interconnectivity and computer aspects to this, and being able to just provide that module of training to upskill them and at the same time make the infrastructure more secure is something we've also started a pilot in the last year. I'm actually flying out to Kansas next week to speak at NRICA, so something that I talked to you about before and Chris previously in the director position is I always stand by nobody wants more paper, right?
Yeah, for sure.
The society does not need CISA pushing out more paper, doesn't need the US government pushing out more paper. We need solutions, but that's hard, right? And the best example I think of that is the water sector. There are 148,000 public systems for water. How do you even begin? You think, I mean, you don't have a list. I don't think anybody has a list, right? You talk about CIRCEA, and it's starting to be, let's be data-driven with the answers to this. And it starts with, let's get the data to be able to do that.
Yep.
And so the approach that I'm flying out to Kansas City to speak at NRACA out was where we put our money where our mouth is with going, okay, let's do a pilot program with electric cooperatives who are the have-nots in the electric infrastructure. There are 900 of them. They cover 56% of the land mass in the United States, about 12 to 15% of residents for electric production. A lot of the smaller communities and businesses for manufacturing in the industrial parks depend on electric co-ops to be able to build for them. Because of the war in the Ukraine, this was a prediction we had last year, it wasn't just the cybersecurity impacts of that, it was the ripple in the supply chain, because at the end of the day, blowing things up is still a really good solution to knocking out critical infrastructure. And the ability for the supply chain, which is global and linked, to be able to provide those parts, well, that affects us here. And that is affecting those electric co-ops in those smaller communities who can't even get the parts to be able to build these pieces, which is the invisible part of economic progress in this country. And so we've been in discussions with them, and I'll be publicly talking about that program that we're looking at doing to do a pilot at the community level with a way to maybe this is a solution for those have-nots to take across. But like anything, we're doing a data-driven approach of, sure, I got an idea.
Yep.
It might be wrong. We might learn something from it, and then iterate from there and start to bring in more parts of government in the community where we think we have something.
Yeah, and we'd love to partner with you and anybody on this in particular. You know, one of the things, I was out at Vandy last week, and a gentleman, a professor from Quinnipiac, came up to me and sort of was excited. He said, as part of our project, we gave our students the cybersecurity performance goals, and they went out to small businesses in the community, sort of as like cyber advisors, and work with them to implement some of those. And so they're going to do their report back. But things using that type of tool for entities that are not well resourced, and actually to your point, EPA actually took their sanitary survey goals and questions and then did a version of the CPGs that could be put together with those questions that, you know, the mandatory sanitary surveys. And so innovative ways of using tools that are simpler. So those are, you know, it's an extract essentially of the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is kind of the gold standard. But, you know, if you're one of the 33.2 million small businesses, the 99.9% of our economy, you don't know how to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so you want a much simpler guide. You can actually take the CPGs in a checklist format and then characterize them by cost, complexity, and speed. And if you do low cost, or not cost complexity and impact. So if you do low cost, high impact, low complexity, there's sort of 8 important things that you can get done, and trying to make it as simple as possible and frankly, as low cost as possible. So we would love to work with other folks in the community who are doing creative things on that, because it's all about getting down to the level, because everything's connected, getting down to the level where there's not a lot of resources, but there is a lot of risk.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with you. The NIST CSF, if you print it out, can absolutely help small business as something they can put their monitor on for the right size.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great framework. We used it, of course, when I was at Morgan Stanley, but our budget for cybersecurity was $600 million.
Yeah, the way I've always phrased that euphemistically is you have the budget of a small country.
Yeah, I know. It's impressive for a big firm, but that's not what we're dealing with. That's very unique and rare.
So you mentioned space, which is now in the latest discussion as throwing yet another on the stack of critical infrastructure designations. What do you think of that as a potential SRMA?
Yeah, I know. My teammate Kemba talked a bit about this, and they've had some meetings with space folks. I think it should be a part of the conversation. We haven't relooked the 16 sectors, I think, since PPD 21. What I think is a little bit more urgent right now, and what we're focused on using the Federal Senior Leadership Council, is how do you make that judgment in a deliberate, rigorous way? What's the analysis that says it should be space, or maybe space is a subsector of energy, or should it be dams, or should it be? So I think we just need a very rigorous way to answer those questions, and that's what we're using the Sector Analysis Working Group, which is a subgroup under the FSLC. Again, bringing CISA together as the national coordinator with all of the sector risk management agencies. And so we have not heretofore really had that kind of deliberate rigor in the process to do that analytic calculus. And so that's what I think is most important in that process. And we'll take a look at space as we're doing all the other stuff.
So smart cities, at the end of the day, we're going to be having IoT and industrial control systems increasingly part of our daily lives, all the way for the good things of, wouldn't it be nice to know that I can be automatically rerouted by the city so we can handle traffic jams? When I look at a lot of the work I've done internationally on smart cities, I think the most interesting kind of tagline I saw to it was out of Abu Dhabi, where they looked at smart cities as a direct correlation to citizen happiness. Right? At the end of the day, we'll make citizens more happy by smart city implementation. However, as with every function, as what we described, there's the flip side.
Yeah.
By more function, we have more risk. And so you put out guidance on the cybersecurity best practices for smart cities. What is it? And clearly we're going there, so why is it important?
We are going there. So hopefully folks have seen that. We were excited. We were working on that for a while. It actually started with a conversation with the NCSC, with my counterpart over there, Lindy. They call them connected places. And so there was a little bit like, oh, what do we call this thing? Because I didn't really understand what connected places meant. So
I still don't.
Yeah, we ended up with smart cities. But I mean, just it's another facet of the world that we're moving into, where we want to make people's lives easier. We want to make people happy. I'm not quite sure I get that correlation, but okay. But everything comes with risk, and so we have to get ahead of the risk. And so essentially, it laid out just how do we think about supply chain, how do we think about community planning, what are the things that we should put in place from an operational risk reduction, and then usefully, I thought, gave a lot of references to people who are actually, the cyber people or the security people who are involved in urban planning. Or you could think about the city management board kind of taking a look at all these different resources. And so it was, again, something that was a first of its kind document that was all of this is where, at the end of the day, it's what I think is really important. You bring NSA's view, FBI's view, CISA's view, and then our international partners were part of that. I'm really proud, I might have mentioned this earlier, of the fact that we are now together as a cyber community around the world, because cyber defense doesn't really have, cyber doesn't have borders, but cyber defense doesn't change a lot among various countries. And so important for us to come together as, remember Super Friends? I think of like Hall of Justice versus Legion of Doom. You come together and everything's like multi-sealed, and we're sending that signal that we are united in our approach here. So if you're if you're Manchester, or if you're Sydney, or if you're Chicago, these are common things that all these cities should look at. So that's what I was excited about. We rolled that out in Belfast at Cyber UK, and you're going to continue to see that, all these sort of multi-seal approaches.
So ransomware.
Yes, ransomware.
Ransomware grows, continues. Where are we going with this? What are we trying to do?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think you often read about, here's this report that says it's up, it says it's down. again, I think one of the most important things to happen out of Colonial Pipeline was the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Acts, or SIA, that we're in the process of writing the rule for. A lot of listening sessions, very consultative, aiming to harmonize this along with the other asks on industry. But until we get that in place, until there's an actual requirement to report in within 72 hours of a significant cyber incident, and we can collect that data in a more disciplined and rigorous way so we can make sense of it, I think it's, it will continue to be anecdotal, quite frankly. So I think CIRCIA is really, really important. Again, hard to measure risk reduction per se. I do think since 2021, when there was really a huge priority, and even before ransomware became a thing, as you know, Chris Krebs was talking a lot about this, was very prescient on it. So I think there's been a lot of goodness done, right? We launched stopransomware.gov as a one-stop shop. You can go to learn about it, how to protect yourself, how to respond to it. We have done a lot to bring together coherent advisories and products. Again, multi-sealed. What's the type of ransomware, but more importantly, how do you mitigate risk to it? The other thing in the CIRCIA legislation that we've already done is the Joint Ransomware Task Force. That is co-led by FBI and CISA. It's stood up. It's under the umbrella of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC. There are two things that we are already putting into play. One is the ransomware vulnerability warning pilot, which essentially is entities sign up for vulnerability scanning, and then we provide them a list of those vulnerabilities that we've seen utilized for ransomware operations. So we're already putting that in play, and that's really to reduce the prevalence. And then the thing that I'm most excited about, because it's a good day when you can prevent people from having a bad day, is our pre-ransomware notification initiative. And this is built off the back of the trust that the team has really been able to catalyze with researchers, with threat intel, with industry. They send in tips that ransomware has been deployed on a network, because we know there's sort of hours to days before it's actually activated. And so we get those tips, and we use our field force to reach out to these entities to let them know, hey, you've got this ransomware, you've got this bad stuff on your network, you need to do something about it ASAP. And since the beginning of the year, we've done that 225 times. And that includes hospitals, it includes K through 12, it includes educations of institutions of higher learning, like to include the one that not involved in this, but as we know, the one that closed down because of the ransomware attack. And it includes big corporations. My friend Jamil Farshi, the CISO of Equifax, just wrote a post, some of you might have seen this on LinkedIn, about the fact that we gave him a call, tipped him to malware we saw on their network, and the FBI amplified it, and it gave him 124 hours to be ready for getting hit, and there wasn't a scratch. And so there's big corporations, there's small entities, but I think this kind of innovation where we're using the trust that we've built and the field forces that we've built to actually prevent somebody from having a really bad day, I mean, that makes this job really worth it. And then the other things that we're putting in place, obviously the work that we're doing with Pipeline and ICS to put detection capabilities in place. We have a capability called Cyber Sentry. I think we're putting out some more information on that next week, but we have gotten authorization for that. We've gotten money for that. And if you talk to some of the companies that we work with, they will give you very positive feedback on that as a value add. And then I think the CPGs have really helped in terms of, again, an easier, simpler metric that these entities can use to help them drive down risk to their network. But, it's a really hard problem. I would also point to some great work being done by FBI and DOJ and Treasury. I mean, this really is a team sport. And then the work catalyzed by Anne Neuberger and the NSC to build the International Counter Ransomware Initiatives. I was just with Anne and Nate Fick yesterday at an event and sort of talking about, again, how to build that global community to enable us to go after this problem at the source, but also to help companies raise the bar on cyber hygiene.
So we also just threw our hat in the ring. We've just formalized a partnership with the Institute for Security and Technology. They just celebrated last week their 2-year anniversary with the ransomware task force.
Phil and Megan and all that. It's great.
So we're with Phil and Megan now, and we're bringing more of the critical infrastructure view of it, which is different and has a different perspective. So the nonprofit ICS Village is now doing that too.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I saw Craig Newmark was
Yep.
very
Yep.
gracious.
Craig showed up and did the publisher house approach,
Yeah.
and his original donation was going to be for $500,000. And on stage, he literally broke out a Sharpie, crossed out the $500,000, and it became $1 million right there on stage.
Such a generous. I love his idea of civil cyber defense, and we've really picked up on that and are working with him, and to protect the most vulnerable, but also to ensure that we have this education K through 12, but really K through gray, so that we all know what we need to do to protect ourselves online. It has to be a whole of society effort.
So my favorite question to close out every one of my interviews
Yeah.
is, it's easy to get mired in the challenges, the day-to-day, the politics, the scope of the problem.
Mm.
You get a magic wand. It's not internet connected. It's truly air-gapped. That's how you know it's magic, because it's actually air-gapped.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah.
You get one.
You asked me this question last year. So, I mean, I've talked about the kind of things that I think could really catalyze a different approach, right? The things like technology safety, corporate cyber responsibility, persistent operational collaboration, societal resilience. Like, those are the things that we're working towards and advancing. I always think about these questions, frankly, of being a mom. And a friend of mine from grad school, Roman Krznarek, he's a philosopher and also an author. So his latest book is called How to Be a Good Ancestor. And it kind of goes to your point. We're stuck in the day-to-day. What am I doing next week? What are my quarterly revenue earnings? What is my, 2 years, I got to run for election again, or 6 years or 4 years. And we're always in this world where we're pulled into the urgent. And, our longest term is sort of 3-4 years. And he argues that we need to think differently about the world that we are leaving to our great-grandchildren and generations ahead. And so you really sort of think differently. And to me, the two epoch-defining challenges of our time are China and artificial intelligence. And I think about the world that I want to leave to my great-grandkids is a world where, we are still a global superpower. The US still has technological supremacy. This is all important because we're a values-based democracy. We put the right guardrails in place while still being able to lead on technology innovation for artificial intelligence, but without it ending humanity, which would be ungood. But the thing that if I really had a magic wand, I could make a difference, I would, try and bring America back to an America that is focused on threats outside. I just feel like, again, as a mom in the world that my son's inheriting, there's just so much tearing among the fabric of our society. And you were in the Army, I was in the Army, we were overseas fighting for the nation. We weren't fighting for Republicans or Democrats, we were fighting for American values. And I just seeing a lot of this over the course of my career, of my life. My dad started out as a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He was in the Reagan administration, as was my mom. I was in the Bush administration. I was in the Obama administration, the Biden administration. I'm a big believer that these issues around the security of our nation are not partisan or political. And so I would hope that we can come together and sort of, as the president talks about, kind of heal the soul of America, and focus on our real adversaries. And I hope that's what we all bring a long-term view to.
And I would hope there should be no easier place to do it than cybersecurity, which doesn't care about your politics.
Exactly. Rock on, brother. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was really good.
Oops, sorry. What's that?
Okay, the first panel of the day. Hopefully folks come back in the room for it. Balancing national resiliency and innovation, how to do effective critical infrastructure cyber regulations. There's been a steady drumbeat of cybersecurity incidents, intelligence assessments, and press articles bringing into focus threats to the infrastructure that makes our modern way of life possible. Government has taken on new responsibilities and exercising authorities to regulate cybersecurity in many of these infrastructures with mixed reception and application. This panel convenes both government and industry to discuss how we can take a balanced approach to regulation that achieves national security outcomes while allowing for industry innovation to this acute threat. On top of that, I'd also like to give a personal thank you and shout out. Post up, sir. Mark Bristow, who I've known for a long time. We suffered through CISA. Mark is why we are here at MITRE today. Certainly there are a lot of things in between that with a lot of staff who did a lot of things to make that happen. But it is Mark who saw Hack the Capitol 5.0 last year with way too many people in too small a space and said, I can do something about that. And so Mark, thank you for hosting us.
Happy to be here.
Floor is yours.
Thanks, sir. No, good. I can hear myself now. So come on down. So yes, thank you, Bryson, for the introduction. Here, I'll stand over here as we arrange according to our headshots. That is a really old headshot of mine too. I got to get that fixed. I don't work at CISA anymore. So we were very shocked that we didn't have the same draw as Jen, but that's okay. We decided that we really wanted to kick off with a totally non-controversial topic of how to regulate critical infrastructure. And as Bryson said in the introduction, there's a lot to kind of unpack on this topic, and I think everyone is learning across industry and government, and those of us that are tweeners like MITRE who are trying to support both. So it's a really important thing about how do we get this right, because you can do it wrong in both ways, right? And so you're not here to hear about this from me. When we talk about the panelists, a quick introduction for myself other than what Bryson said. So Mark Bristow, I'm the director of the Cyber Infrastructure Protection Innovation Center here at MITRE, or CIPIC. So we're focused on supporting critical infrastructure, operational technology, defensive operations, and building tools and capabilities to help people do that better and better at scale. I've been here a little over 1 year. Before that, I worked at CISA, which is why I have a fancy American flag headshot and a CISA pin on in my graphic. But I was there for 14 years where I, at the end of my career there, was kind of leading cyber defense operations for CISA. Okay, if I lean down, it's really loud. So immediately to my left is Rob Morgus. So he is a senior advisor in the Chief Security Office at Berkshire Hathaway Energy, where he runs several programs related to risk management and resilience. Rob has a decade of experience in national security. Prior to joining Berkshire Hathaway, was a senior director at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, of which a lot of very relevant topics to cybersecurity regulation came out of, where he led the commission's work on resilience, ecosystem security, and public-private collaboration. While at the commission, he was a lead author of several of the commission white papers, including papers on supply chain, another totally not hot button topic, the water sector, maritime sector, and the transition book for the Biden administration. So welcome, Rob. We got Peter Colombo. So he's a senior advisor at CISA, and he's the government one on the panel. So he's in the hot seat at CISA's cybersecurity division, focused on industrial control systems initiatives. He previously served on the team charged with drafting CISA's cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals, or the CPGs, which is very relevant here, and is now managing the effort to develop sector-specific cybersecurity performance goals across CISA. He previously served as the program manager at the Department of Veteran Affairs FFRDC program and as a project manager at the Department of Treasury. So, colleague from CISA. Lots of former citizens on this panel. And then finally, we have Kate Ledesma. She's the head of public policy and government affairs for Dragos. Prior to joining Dragos' team, Kate served in senior cybersecurity policy roles in both government and industry. She managed resilience policy for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the EISAC, where she ran the grid security exercise GridX. She's a former senior policy advisor for at CISA, who also serves as deputy chief of staff for the Office of Infrastructure Protection at the Intelligence Analysis and in the U.S. Department of State. She's a graduate of the Eisenhower School at NDU, the National Defense University, where she earned a master's in National Research Strategy. Ms. Ledesma is a frequent speaker, writer, and commentator in cybersecurity and critical infrastructure issues. So that is our panel. I'm going to grab some water because I've already tripped on my words twice, and we'll get right into it. So I like to start panels a little differently. I like to start panels with what I call a lightning question. So I am going to limit the panelists, much to their chagrin, to just a yes, no, or it depends answer for this first question about whether or not cyber regulations actually help or hurt our ability to mitigate risk. So Rob, you're next to me, so you can go first. Two.
It depends. Sometimes helpful. I think I would say depends to unhelpful.
Depends to unhelpful. So like a compendium of depends. Okay. Pete?
Say yes if.
Okay, yes if. Okay. It depends. All right. So no strong. Are we not miking? Could everyone hear everybody? Just me. I'm the only important one. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
I just flicked on. I got green. I just flipped it on them. So.
Can you say something now?
Test, test.
Testing.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry about that. So let's do that real quick again.
Unhelpful, it depends.
Yes if.
It depends.
Okay. So no one, it was on the binary scale. So that's good because I think that the answer is ultimately going to land somewhere in the middle, right? But I think that we can probably pull out examples where it has worked well and where things haven't worked well, right? And if we look at cybersecurity regulation over time, I mean, really, you could sort of have it start with like the DoD color rainbow books and that kind of stuff back in the 90s. But really, cybersecurity for critical infrastructure regulation is still somewhat new from a regulatory framework. We've had a lot of safety and security things, which are interrelated to cyber regulations, but are kind of differently adjudicated across the agencies. So I promise to let you expand a little bit. So again, we'll just kind of go in order of answering the question. Why was it it depends to maybe not?
I think Bryson in his chat with Jen brought up a pretty good point, and that is for a long time we assumed systems were architected similarly, if not the same. In some cases, I do think we can see a decent amount of homogeneity. And in those cases, I think you can begin to hew towards solutions where you can paint with a broader brush, right? In those cases, I do think we are likely to see more success from regulation. However, in most operational environments at this point, you have legacy systems, you have new systems, everyone's architecting and building differently. Although there are efforts, and we can talk about those in a little bit, to drive a little bit more continuity across sectors in particular. But when you have such diverse environments, the owners and operators understand those environments better than anyone else. They understand what needs to go in to protect those environments better than anyone else. And if a regulator is not engaged with those owners and operators, you can have some pretty bad outcomes. If they are engaged and they're willing to be flexible, and I think they ask the right questions over the sort of RFP term, or RFI term, then I think we can see some pretty good outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with most of that, and I said yes if because the if part of that statement is if they're risk informed and outcome focused. So I'll defer a lot back to our experience in drafting the cross-sector performance goals, not just talking about book. I don't get paid on commission. That's just where a lot of our experience came from in the recent past, and that's something we consistently heard across stakeholders. And that notion of stakeholder engagement, I will probably raise that in every question that gets asked, because I think doing that in an effective way and doing that in a broad base is how you get that input on, as an operator, walk me through how you would implement this and does it actually help? And I think even beyond the operator community, there's also the OEMs, the other service providers that all have insight or feedback on, hey, these are the implications of saying it the way you said it. And so all that goes to, and getting those folks in the room to talk to each other, not just the regulator, all goes into crafting something that, hey, we're going to rely on your knowledge of your own domain, the experience of your personnel to achieve an outcome we all want, but to do it in a way that keeps your operations safe and running effectively.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think it really depends on how cybersecurity regulations are developed and implemented. If they are thoughtfully developed and implemented in coordination with experts from the affected sectors or industry, they certainly can raise the bar on cybersecurity maturity for that sector and then also reduce aggregate risk to the nation. As we continue to have this conversation about cybersecurity regulation, I think what we need to do is keep focus on true risk reduction and security and not focus as much on simple compliance. At best case scenario, when we focus on regulatory compliance, it becomes a distraction. It becomes a checklist, and it doesn't really do very much to reduce risk. And I think more than that, technology is changing so rapidly that very prescriptive regulations become outdated almost as soon as they are written, and again, aren't extremely effective in reducing risk. Worst case scenario, poorly written regulatory language can actually distract risk managers from that true focus of reducing risk and building additional security. So, as we continue to have these conversations, do so in coordination with industry, providers, OEMs, and asset owners and operators, and focus on true risk reduction and not just simple compliance.
I think if I can pick up on
Sure.
a couple points there, Kate's right. And when I was in government, I often thought about malicious compliance, right? And this is this notion that you adhere to the letter of the regulation of the law, no further. And if you can find a way to make that cheap or cost effective for yourself, you do it. You have a good story about that I'm sure you'll tell later. I do think, I've been at Berkshire Hathaway for about a year and change now, and seeing from the inside how the risk and compliance situation works there and how it sort of feeds off of or leans up against the actual security office because they are separated. I look at it and I say, I would rather spend $10 on actual risk mitigation than $100 or than I guess that doesn't make sense. We'd rather be spending our money on actual risk mitigation than compliance is the sort of broad brush. On Pete's point about the engagement, I think one of the keys there is, and it varies from sector to sector, you need forums for that engagement, right? And I think we're seeing some interesting and potentially unlikely or unexpected options pop up in the federal government, the JCDC, which is not a regulatory body, but can play this role in bringing the parties together to have needed conversations to sort of set baselines, begin to get nomenclature right, and the like. I think we're seeing some promise there, but it's inconsistent across sectors is what I'd say right now.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I heard from all of you as you kind of expanded on those was that there's value, I think, in those regulations for risk reduction, just not compliance. And there's a need to keep them flexible so they can adapt to technology and those types of things, which I think is true. But I'm gonna turn this one over to you, Peter. I think one of the challenges that the other thing I hear a lot from my colleagues in industry is regulatory harmonization, right? Because there's a lot of different regulatory frameworks out there, and there's different agencies kind of dabbling with cyber in a way that is not necessarily coordinated. And I think many are looking to CISA, a non-regulatory body, to referee that, for lack of a better term. And I think that to your point about the non-homogeny that we have in our environments, I think that makes it really, really challenging. So from your chair, like, how do you see those two masters of having something that's flexible and not super specific in driving compliance? Because I think we can all agree that compliance-based outcomes are ultimately not going to really reduce risk. They're very measurable, but they're not going to necessarily reduce all the risk. But how do you balance that with the trying to make something that is equally applicable to multiple sectors with lots of different technologies?
Yeah, no, that's the critical question. And I would say with what we have now with the cross-sector goals, as you said, so we're a regulator in very limited sense in the chemical sector, but generally not a regulator. And so the way we position the cross-sector goals that are out there now, are the CPGs that you heard the director refer to, is we consider that a floor. So we're saying regardless of your size, your sector, your level of maturity, you should be doing these minimums. So by extension, any regulation conceivably should be at or above that. Because what we also don't want to do is say, hey, the CPGs are the way to go. If you're exceeding that, hey, you can dial it back because we just set the minimum. Like we don't want that to be the case. And so I think part of the value in the CPGs is it was formed out of the input from across sectors. It had the input of all those different stakeholders, which includes the regulators too, right? Not just the owner-operator community to agree, hey, we think these things are important. And there's a large segment of critical infrastructure in the US, especially where you have a lot of privately owned infrastructure that may not be regulated. Like certain sectors, as I mentioned, the chemical sector, some portions are regulated, some aren't. And so with those performance goals, we're trying to set a minimum floor of, at a minimum, if you're not doing all these things, this is where you need to invest to make a difference. Now, when it comes to regulatory harmonization, in the recent national cyber strategy, so the White House pointed to NIST and pointed to CISA and said, hey, regulators, these should be your starting points. And we think part of the value there is with something like the CPGs. Again, it's informed by the perspective of a wide base. And, we can use that as a starting point, especially for agencies that may not have a lot of deep cyber background, to say, okay, this is the starting point. And also, all these agencies got together and agreed, hey, we called this thing this, and this is the definition we use for it. So when we say phishing-resistant MFA, and we all kind of sort of agree this is what we mean by that. And so we understand and we acknowledge that given sector risk management agencies own their sector domain, CIS is a generalist by nature. We don't have specific experience necessarily in all these sectors to the depth that the owner-operators do, that the regulator does. But to get people to kind of coalesce around these common ideas of, we think these things are important, we're giving you a way to do it, but not necessarily the way to do it. And I think that's where we've tried to position the CPGs.
All right. So for a long time, before we had the kind of new regulatory frameworks that had come out in the CPGs, there were voluntary standards, right? And a lot of industries used voluntary standards for quite some time as a way to kind of set those baselines, right? And to your point, there will be most of my work is rooted in running around responding to cybersecurity incidents in other people's control systems, right? So I have an immediately biased view of the universe to that subset, but you have these organizations. So I have been to multinational oil companies with abysmal security and all the money in the world, and I've been to tiny little water utilities with amazing security and duct tape and bubble gum, right? And so with the voluntary kind of regime, right, and kind of balancing that, the requirements there, you got a lot of disparate implementation, right? And when you're trying to set the floor, you're also going to get a lot of disparate implementation. And CISA, as the kind of national risk manager for cyber, really has a role in really driving the national security outcomes, right? You look at the recent ODNI threat assessment that came out that talked about, specifically Russia and China having capabilities against various industrial control system sectors, right? And, basically ready to go. How do you manage that national risk perspective that is potentially going to be very equally applied? And I don't want to just keep picking on you because that's not fair. So I'm actually going to ask Kate, from a Draco's perspective, you get to work with a lot of different sectors as owner operators. Have you seen anything that would help guide the regulatory process that would actually help buy down that national risk, even if it's going to be a little bit differently applied for different industry verticals?
Yeah, I think first a few comments on the voluntary standards and frameworks. I think the voluntary standards and frameworks have been tremendously helpful in getting us to where we are today as a community. We obviously still have work to do, but we are light years ahead of where we were a decade ago. Like Peter said, it gave us a common lexicon to start talking about some of these issues that we didn't have before. I think the NIST cybersecurity framework in particular has been effective for a couple of reasons. that really speak to, I think, the needs of industry and government. So it takes a risk-based approach, right? And it coordinates cyber risk with enterprise risk. Organizations are facing all kinds of risks today, not just cyber risk. So I think that's really important. I think the second reason why the NIST cybersecurity framework is effective is it's adaptable. A large component of managing cyber risk today is deciding where to invest. And I think frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, voluntary standards and frameworks, give organizations a comprehensive way to evaluate this, choose where they need to invest based on the gaps that they found versus the risk that those gaps carry. And then also to communicate that to other economic stakeholders, whether that's inside the organization, whether that's investors, whether that's government organizations. So it gave us a common way to talk about risk and a common way to start thinking about how to invest in risk. I think we've all on the panel talked about the fact that cybersecurity and networks aren't all equal. And even across industries or within the same organization, networks aren't the same. And so I think, we have this phrase in the industry, protect diamonds like diamonds and pencils like pencils. And so I think some of these voluntary frameworks have helped get us to where we are today and start to do that.
It's an economic question. Private sector guy, economic question.
Well, all this costs money.
It all costs money. We need better levers to pull, I think, to facilitate more voluntary partnership and more voluntary implementation of standards and guidance. I think I'll give a somewhat concrete example. So electricity sector, heavily regulated, price regulated, usually by public utility commissions, state level organizations. If you want to invest in something, you need to justify that cost to the Public Utility Commission. Pretty much full stop. If you have, and this is an interesting regulatory catch, right? If you have a voluntary standard that doesn't always provide the evidence that you need in that hearing to make that investment. If you have a regulation that says you have to do this, you have the evidence that you need. It's a really, really interesting dynamic. That said, I think that there's an opportunity for voluntary standard setters and regulators to work across with states, right, to understand when those types of dynamics might rear their head and try to provide some guidance to PUCs and the like to help alleviate some of those concerns. Because to Kate's point, yes, it's an economic question, right? You need to convince all the economic stakeholders. In some cases, that's your board. In some cases, that's the C-suite. In some cases, it's your public utility commissioner.
Yeah, I've heard a CEO of a very large energy company who will remain nameless literally say, regulate us so we can justify the rate case.
No idea who that could have been.
But I think your point is an important one, right? Is that when we're expressing risk, and I think we all want to buy down this risk. Everyone in this room and everyone that's watching online, by virtue of showing up, and thank you for that, by the way, already understand that cybersecurity of industrial control system environments is important, and it's something that we need to address, right? But we are a biased group, right? This is not a fact everywhere. Bryson mentioned in his kind of opening remarks about the Colonial Pipeline incident, right? And I fully agree with him that the Colonial Pipeline was a great way to get your grandmother to understand what you do, right? But that's not the entire framework of these things, right? Because at the end of the day, implementing cybersecurity controls is going to cost somebody money, right? They don't come free, right? Although I know Dragos gives out some of their stuff for free. It's not their business model, I'm pretty sure. I haven't asked Rob, but I'm pretty sure that's not their whole business model, right? So how do we resource this, right? And that goes back to Kate. There was something you said that I thought was important here is about like, how do we effectively communicate this, right? And with the boards and Rob, you double tapped on it. What has been successful in that argument from mostly your two perspectives on those cases? Like what works with a rate case? Because if you say, hey, I have a regulatory requirement, you're done, right? But you don't want a regulatory requirement that has that one thing. Like we all agree that we need some flexibility in that, right? So how do we communicate that effectively in a way that can get us the resources necessary to close the national security risk, not just the individual company risk, but the national security risk?
With rate cases, it's just incredibly inconsistent. I mean, you're dealing with different levels of maturity in each of the jurisdictions that you need to go to those, right? So there's a maturity question there and a capacity building question there. Generally speaking, if you can point to something that allows you to say this is an accepted best practice, then you probably are going to have a positive decision on it. But like I said, it varies across. I think the sort of C-suite and the board question is different. I think oftentimes what I've found is highlighting, and this is still an incredibly difficult thing to do. We don't have good quantification even for IT security, let alone OT security, but highlighting the potential cost savings, even if you need to go way long run, has by and large been the most effective way, I think, to do so. But at the same time, depending on personalities, appealing to the fact that this is a national security concern also can go a long way. Most executives want to be doing the right thing for the country and for the business, especially I think in more of the heavily regulated sectors. So that argument I think does go a long way. It's allowed us to have quite a bit of support from our higher ups who take that particular piece of the equation very seriously. But it varies for sure.
And I think that's interesting perspective from the CISA seat, because when we originally started on the performance goals, we designed for a technical audience in mind. And by the time we got to the end, it was a 180 flip to what you're talking about, where our intent is for these to be used by the C-suite, or for the technical folks to take it to the C-suite to say, I'm not coming up with this on my own. Like, here is, codified best practice that CISA derived from the input from all these people to say, hey, this is a worthwhile investment. And so, understanding that's still not binding, but at least we hope, our intent is that there's some kind of, that the emphasis there is highlighted by the fact that this was not crowdsourced, but derived from all this input by a lot of people in this room, by the company stakeholders themselves, to say we all agree these things generally matter, and like you said, if the senior leadership they want to do the right thing, this is trying to make their job easier to say, okay, let's limit the universe to what you actually need to look at, to these 30 some odd things that if you put money to this, it reduces risk, which ideally is a savings later on to you.
I think even just the language and the lexicon that we've been using more recently to talk about cybersecurity, we talk about it as cyber risk. So when you talk about security, I think a lot of organizations think about that as a cost center, right, and not a revenue protector. And we've seen this kind of shift, I think, in the way we speak about it. We talk more about cyber risk. And I think, at organizations, the decision makers, the financial decision makers, economic decision makers, they understand risk. They understand financial risk. They understand organizational risk. And so talking about cybersecurity as cyber risk has really, I think, given us a way to communicate with those particular stakeholders in a way that we didn't have before. And so I think, to answer your question, it's a layered approach, just like any layered security approach, right? You speak the language you need to speak to the technical operators. And I think we've done a good job through some of the voluntary frameworks and also regulatory frameworks of doing that. But then you also have to have the language you need to speak externally to your investors and stakeholders, to speak to the C-suite. And I think, even in the new national cybersecurity strategy, there was this emphasis on using language that leaders and organizations understand to talk about cybersecurity and see it not as a cost center, but as a revenue protector. In addition to, the need to focus on protecting our national security. At the end of the day, organizations don't want downtime. They don't want a cybersecurity incident, because that's going to cost them. They want to remain operational, and they want to protect their IP and information, and they want to protect their customers' IP and information. So I think organizations want to do that. They just need a way to talk about it in a common language with their security teams.
So all of you mentioned talking to the C-suites and that kind of stuff, but I want to jump in on something that you said, Rob, which is about like the utility commissions, right? There's another fabric here that there's state, local regulators that I think maybe we need CPGs for pucks, right? Because without a certain level of maturity, these organizations that are mostly focused on protecting the ratepayer and making sure that investments are aligned with kind of the social fabric. But if we're making a lot of progress based on all the feedback here on the C-suite and the boardroom, how should we be addressing this kind of other community that maybe isn't getting what they need from the cyber haves in order to figure out how to parse these. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to the buzzword of capacity building. There are obviously national level bodies, NARUC, for example, that pull these groups together. And to their credit, there have been more conversations started and unfolding on this exact topic in those forums. Honestly, I think a lot of it is on the regulated entities. We need to do a better job of communicating why and how, right? And certainly things like the CPGs and work that CISA does or NIST does, or in some cases NERC does, right, can help feed into that and build better understanding, better capacity at that state or regional level. But yeah, I think it's going to be a sort of an all hands approach where, I don't want to absolve the role of the utilities themselves in doing a better job of communicating why. And I think, the cost center versus revenue protector thing is such a salient framing for all of this, right? Because at the end of the day, the public utility commissions actually also want to help us limit costs and protect our revenue, because their job is to keep the rates low. And we want to keep the rates low, right? We're providing an essential service. We don't want to be gouging people for it. So I think, again, that cost center revenue protector framing is a good place to start. And the more that we can pull together in terms of frameworks, in terms of references, to really help educate utility commissioners at the local level, and the more they can do to bring folks on with a little bit of expertise, the better off we'll all be.
And Mark, I know you were joking, but I think NARUC and DOE are actually doing an initiative similar to what you're saying that's kicking off soon. So if there's anybody from DOE here, I think stay tuned for more on that.
Yeah, and I think, Kate, I think you hit a point, and Rob, you hit that as well, that it's really important. It's the quantification, right? Like to this day, I don't think we still don't have a really good way to articulate cybersecurity risk in IT or OT, right? And I know that back when I was at CISA, Olga and her team were working on this and continue to do that. And there's been some research projects on how do you quantify cybersecurity risk. But I always harken back to, I think it was like 10 or 15 years ago now. I'm starting to get a little too gray. There was a proposal that went through the Washington Water Service Authority here in DC to start a cybersecurity project to basically modernize the network that runs the water utility here in the District of Columbia. And it ultimately went to a voter resolution, and it amounted to like I think it was like going to cost the average ratepayer like $15 over the course of the year. So reasonably low, rate impact. And it was soundly defeated by the voters of the District of Columbia. How do we help quantify this risk better in terms that they understand, so that we can make this case not only to the utility commissions, which I think is a much more solvable thing, but how do we get that in a way that we can show it as protecting revenue as opposed to imposing costs? And how does the regulatory framework, because again, going back to the just regulate me comment, it makes the case easy, right? Whereas we're talking about a much more nuanced conversation. So we got to make that nuanced conversation match the regulations that ultimately have that impact. Way off script with the questions, but this is where the conversation went. So
give a first thought on that one. I think this is where agencies like DOE, agencies like CISA, especially CISA, looking as a national risk manager, looking at risk management across all sectors. This is where they can be really effective and help the states, help local municipalities, help industry and private sector do our jobs better, right? I think that's where CISA has the unique ability to bring all the different stakeholders together to build models and frameworks that can help us do that.
We're going to border on sort of philosophical conversation here, but I actually don't think that's the right way to do it.
Okay.
I don't think that quantifying is going to move the needle with the public if you're asking for public funds directly from the public to invest in security. I don't think that it's not going to matter. There are other ways to get public funds to projects in need. I think we saw a bunch of movement on the Hill with some really interesting grant programs that are coming out of the federal coffers, right? Some of that needs to go to state and local. Some of that should be funding DC public water to modernize, right? I mean, That's the fact of the matter. And when you have this situation where you rely on the mass to agree to spend more money on something that they don't see instant gratification from, I'm not sure you're going to move the needle. So you need federal entities to potentially step in there and provide ways to offset costs, which I think we've, to the credit of Congress and the administration, we're seeing some of that.
Yeah, I want to second that. I think, when we talk about cybersecurity regulation, we can't just talk about the regulation itself. We have to think next steps.
Yeah.
And I think that includes resourcing.
Yep.
So companies aligning internal resources, but then when we're looking at water utilities, municipalities, small electric co-ops, that sort of thing, we need to think about how to get them the resources that they need to meet the regulatory requirements or make the investments they need to make in their cybersecurity infrastructure.
If you have a public utility commission, it's a different question, right? You are dealing with an expert community at that point, and numbers may actually matter. So their quantification, yeah, that could help. General public and referendums, oof, it'd be tough.
Yeah, I'm confused as to why that ever went to the voters, to be completely honest with you, but I wasn't part of the case. It's just an example I like to flag. But I think that's a great point about resourcing, right? Because we were talking about how to make the internal case for resourcing and how regulations sometimes make that case easier.
Mm-hmm.
But the term unfunded mandate gets bandied around often, right? And regulations are really there, and maybe this is my view of the world, but to put some guardrails on the process, right? So that you can't veer too far off into a way that you could ultimately create broad scale public harm. And I think that we've hit a spot where, again, this community here that's listening to this panel, as well as the people online, represent the cybersecurity haves, right? But the cybersecurity have-nots also, you fall into the category of the people that get regulated, right? So how do we help those organizations kind of get into the game? Because when you look at adversary capabilities and intents, right, going back to the worldwide, or sorry, the threat assessment, they didn't say only the big, mega conglomerates like Berkshire Hathaway, are going to get targeted, right? The objectives of our adversaries might be very small, and that small water utility may be the linchpin to the adversary's goals. So how do we address that in a regulatory context, both from a resourcing perspective, where they're going to be inherently a little bit less mature as smaller organizations, and then also the regulatory perspective?
I think the challenges you're outlining, that's a large part of why CISA sees kind of initiatives behind secure by design, secure by default is so important, is because ideally that shifts or shares some of the burden. I'll give you an example. My wife has a small business, has nothing to do with cybersecurity. It's hard to expect or ask a small entity who that's not their core business, that's not an area of specialization. OPS, you need to learn all these controls and implement them. I give useful advice, but apparently I'm just annoying when I bring it up. But I joke, but that's actually the case on that wide swath of especially small and medium-sized entities. And so I think that's part of why you hear the director putting so much emphasis on that notion of, can we get things in their hands to deploy or to utilize that are, your point about the vote before, if most people had the option 25 years ago, would they have gotten seatbelts in their car? Like, we didn't wear them growing up, maybe, too late to call CPS on my parents, but, people just didn't know to ask, or, the data was there, but the average consumer, that's just not part of the calculus. And so I think that is part of CISA's responsibility to work with industry to say, hey, here are concepts we think can help on aggregate across the nation. How can we start implementing them? And understanding things like that don't happen overnight. Part of that is almost goes back to education programs, and are we training engineers to think in that fashion? So it's a big challenge, but I think we are moving in the right direction towards it, or that's one mechanism to help address what you're talking about.
What about the resourcing side? Because I think CISA has a unique role here.
And so my usual answer is, hey, I'm cybersecurity division. That's not my role. but no, that's a question we always get, especially, there are certain sectors that trend on the smaller side. And, hey, and part of that is CISA has services that it offers. We're trying to do a better job of point to both our own and other things that are accessible to them to say, hey, we put out these 35 or 40 CPGs. Here's where you can access help to do them. That's a panacea for the time being, but, there has to be, use the term unfunded mandate. you cannot put this out there and just throw it into somebody's lap and say, hey, go execute, when, hey, this is not your core role, and to do it effectively would consume, substantial portions of your budget. So I don't know that I have a good answer for how we're doing that yet. We've done the first step of identify a problem, I would say, and there are things being done, but it is an area that, I think we're communicating back from cybersecurity division up the chain to say, when we go to people with these things, we have to have a ready answer for this. Of here's where you can get help, or here's what's coming in behind it to help.
Sorry, Kate, I stepped on you, but I didn't want to let them off the hook on the resourcing half the question. So did you
Well,
have a
and I
comment
think-
you want to inject?
I think a natural follow-on. So I mentioned earlier resourcing. So that includes things like the state and local grant program, federal funding, state funding, and that sort of thing. But I think there's another thing we can look at. The issue, I think, is scalability too, right? While we're waiting for funding sources that can take months and years to come, there's a scalability issue with helping organizations, especially those that are under-resourced, or don't have the cybersecurity resources in the moment to help do some of these things. And I think that's where the vendor community over the last few years has really stepped up to be a part of this collective defense and to help with national defense and defense of our critical infrastructure. When Russia invaded Ukraine, you saw this outpouring of support from the private sector community and offering tools and resources to organizations there. We've seen it back here at home as well. You mentioned Dragos does participate in this. And, CISA is helping to sort of corral and put all of those resources in one place so that organizations know where they can go. CISA's free cybersecurity tools and resources sort of brings it all in one place so organizations can see what's available to them at no or low cost, and at least take the first step in being able to better defend their networks, protect their systems while they wait for the additional resourcing.
I'm sympathetic to the unfunded mandates piece for organizations that rely on appropriations for their operations. I'm also sympathetic to the shifting the burden of security. My sympathy is thin, though. I think businesses that generate their own revenue need to understand that security is a part of doing business now. Full stop. If you can't afford security, maybe you shouldn't be doing business. Now, do some businesses need help to afford that security? Certainly. I also think this whole conversation kind of harkens to notions of prioritization, notions of national risk and the difference between national risk and aggregated risk, and the difference between aggregated risk and individual risk. Individuals understand and hold their risk. You can aggregate that, but that still doesn't always equal the national risk. And individuals are never going to have a view on the national risk. That needs to be the job of entities like DHS and CISA. Who within CISA does it is certainly a topic for conversation. And that needs to be communicated out, and there needs to be better efforts to prioritize what actually matters, because a small business getting popped, yes, it stinks. But if they're not providing a service that is essential to the functioning of society in the country, it stinks. But at the end of the day, it's a much lesser issue than a large water utility getting hit and water not being available for a large city, right? I think Kate's point about offsetting costs also extremely important, always needs to be part of the equation. Another way to sort of mess with the economics of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot there, but I want to bring it back to, so what do we require, right? Because we've covered some ground here where we have organizations of lots of different sizes. I agree with you. It is a cost of doing business, but not everyone is assessing those costs the same, right? Lots of organizations are taking the approach of, well, maybe I can get cyber insurance. I can cyber insurance my way out of this problem to mitigate risk, because quite frankly, it's hard to quantify that risk. Or they're in the camp of, I'm going to ignore it until I get hit with ransomware, and then I'll deal with it, right? Which is, to be fair to the government, not tenable for that national level risk. If you are a critical healthcare provider and taking that approach, the societal risk from your individual organization decision is much broader than just you. And that's kind of where we're at, right? So what can we how do we create that floor that actually starts to buy down the national level risk that CISA is worried about, while also taking into account that different organizations are going to approach it differently?
understand it and prioritize. And I also think we need to acknowledge that we are not going to require the risk away. You can require and mitigate some risk. You are not going to get rid of all of it. So the goal when you set out with requirements should not be to eliminate the risk. It should be to identify the risks that you can actually address and address those.
So let me just carry that thought. Are you positing that we're too broad now with how we're like the regulatory focuses have been?
Two.
Okay.
Sometimes. Yeah.
Depends sometimes. Okay. But a more focused.
Yeah.
Your case.
I think a more
set
focused
of
approach on
controls.
who we are requiring things of
Okay.
is important. And then I think a more rigorous approach to what we are requiring. I mean, this is not groundbreaking by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the point there is acknowledging that you are not going to require everything in terms of risk away, and that you need to identify what you actually think requirements could address and mitigate. And then you need to collaborate and work with the entities that hold this risk to drive as much of that leftover risk down, right? And there are ways to do that beyond requirements, especially if you're dealing with sophisticated entities. And if you're not, then your step is capacity building.
And so, Mark, I think what you described is really CISA's view of what the CPGs should be used for. It is not a cybersecurity program. It is not everything you should do. CSF is better for that, and we would point people to that. We position those performance goals as you know, the baseline, regardless of sector size, informed by, you know, people like you. You gave feedback. A lot of people in this room of these are the things that actually matter. It's not everything you should do. Going back, we'll belabor the car analogy. This is drive the speed limit, wear your seatbelt. There are a dozen more things you should do, you should invest in. But if you're not doing those two things, like, you are remiss. And so to take it a step further, like you said, we can't do all things for everybody. But if you are performing a national critical function or supporting a national critical function, and you are not doing that minimum baseline, which isn't even a full, the full cybersecurity program that you should have, like, there's something seriously remiss. And we put language in there. If you're not doing this, if the things you own aren't capable of this, that should be prioritized for investment. And that's how we say it as a non-regulator. But, again, those were formed out of the experience and the perspective of a lot of people in the owner-operator community, in the SME community, to say these things matter. If you're not doing them, potentially you're not meeting the standard of care for best practice.
Yep, Rob hit on it, and I think that is we're not going to eliminate cyber risk. We're not going to eliminate it. So it's about managing cyber risk, and I think choosing where to invest, having frameworks, having the the cross-sector performance goals, having the NIST cybersecurity framework to help organizations decide where to invest. I think that is how we move forward collectively as a community. And then I think the other part I think everyone up here mentioned is the coordination between government and industry in both development and execution. And then I think we left the last piece out, and maybe that's measurement. So we don't have a great way to measure cybersecurity effectiveness, let alone cybersecurity regulation effectiveness. So I think that's the next step in this sort of evolution of public-private sector partnerships is measuring, so we can look at the baselines and see if we've effectively raised the baseline after we've implemented either voluntary or regulatory initiatives.
Yeah, so I try and let you all talk on these things, right, as moderator, but I think that that's a really important point, and that is my view is that a lot of the compliance, and we talked about at the very top of this, we talked about compliance. In my view, a lot of the compliance regulation regimes and execution and resource alignment is because it's measurable. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that's patched, right? I can't tell you if I will defend myself from China today. That is a much harder conversation to have, and it is a lot more nuanced. And so we kind of revert back down to the baseline when trying to broaden our perspectives to things that we can clearly measure, even if those clearly measurable things ultimately won't make a difference, right? I've been quoted many times as saying, when I was doing incident response at CISA, with the exception of the Black Energy series of cases, there were 6 instances that I could recall where there were actual control systems exploits used. Not 0 days, exploits, but we focus a lot of our compliance regime on things like patching. And how do we bring that maturity level up to a place where we are we are applying the required things in the places that are actually going to frustrate the adversary as opposed to what we can measure. Thoughts on how to do that? That'd be great regulation.
So we're in the process of trying to measure the CPGs now, and it is hard. And I will tell you right off the bat, out of the 39 CPGs, there's probably 20, 25 we can easily measure, or we know like there is a good metric, but the balance of that, it's hard to get. There are things that are easily measurable, but is that an impactful measurement? And so I will say to CIS's credit, we're trying to work on identifying ways that actually make a difference versus saying, oh, we can get a number and we can get a trend on a number and it's a number. So we did a thing, we did a measurement. And that's an area where we're looking to reach out to, again, the owner operator space and the OEM space, say what actually matters or would make a difference. Because I will say we're much more focused on impact than metric of, does this actually make a difference at reducing risk versus is it something that's just easy to put in a report every month?
Yeah, you may be sensing I'm a little jaded on quantification. I think the answer may lie in taking a threat-informed approach to how we do it, right? So understanding those who may try to do harm, and if we're talking about in sort of critical functions, then we're talking about a much narrower swath of adversaries at that point. We can do a better job of understanding them, taking that, modeling, analyzing what we learn there, turning it into resilience actions or regulations, whatever you want to do, and then drilling and exercising that. And then, lather, rinse, repeat, right? You keep that cycle going. I think that's the way we have to move forward. That's the approach that our team takes. So I obviously have a little bit of bias there, but I think it's also an applicable approach for understanding and managing national risk as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things, right? There's the where's seatbelt risk, right? There's the public can be impacted pretty easily risk, and I think there's a clear regulatory imperative
Baseline.
for that baseline. But then, yes, I fully agree with your perspective. Actually, I think that we should be leveraging our understanding of adversaries much more acutely when trying to apply risks. Some of the things that I've done here at MITRE since I got here are trying to drive in that direction, but we're not here to talk about me. But the challenge, I think that, and just to be fair, I told you I was going to ask you this question. The challenge I think that CISA faces, right, is a non-regulatory, okay, CFAT's notwithstanding, but in this instance, non-regulatory agency, is that other agencies are trying to take this floor, which I think you have the right goals for the CPGs, but then turn them into discrete requirements for regulatory requirements. Like the EPA recently did that with their recent orders, right? So how do you work inside government to kind of harmonize that activity and kind of just stapling it to the back of your regulatory requirements and hoping for the best?
Yeah. So what we're doing right now, and you mentioned this at the beginning, is behind those cross-sector goals. We're now working on sector-specific goals, and in a lot of cases, that's looking at the gap between the CPGs and regulation that may exist in the sector, and say, for those particularly unregulated entities, how can we close more of that gap? What additional actions could they take to move them up that spectrum of security or risk reduction? And I think CISA generally not being a regulator was actually a benefit in the CPGs, because I think there was a level of comfort in people dealing with us. And it was a very candid technical talk of, if you ask me to do this, this is how I'm going to do it, and here's why it's not going to work. But I will say, in a very productive fashion. That was one of the things that stood out to me, that I think CISA occupies a good spot in being able to have those conversations. And I will say, on the stakeholder side, people were willing to come to the table and have productive conversation about, how to word things, what would work, where there'd be difficulties. And then so when working on the regulator side, I would say the job's kind of done for us, in the sense that, again, the cyber strategy points to the CPGs and NIST and says, thou shalt use this if you're a regulator. But, there's a lot of action behind that to, how does that actually happen in real life? And where's that dividing line of, I made a change to make it easier on my sector versus I made a change to make it radically different how I wanted to make it. And there's no, forcing function there. So I think it remains to be seen to a degree how we're able to do that effectively. But we do have, again, at least this mandate that says, hey, regulators, you need to look at this. You need to use this as a starting point. And so I think that is a good place to start from right now. Like we have that in hand, and it's a matter of how we can action it now.
How frameworks and CPG's frameworks are moved from the creators and the sort of the technical community that creates them to the regulators is incredibly important, right? So I think you're right, and I think JCDC and other parts of CISA are playing a very important role right now in convening, right, to help bring sectors or cross-sector together to have these conversations, to drive towards baselines, to build better understanding. And speaking from experience in one of those working groups, the moment we start talking about bringing the regulator in, the conversation changes. And some of us say, well, no, we need to bring the regulator in at some point here, because we don't want to just create a document and then send it out into the wild and have them use it however they want to use it. That's not going to work with, we'll say, 75% of regulators. Some can take it and run with it. I have full confidence in that. So, and it's a matter of how you begin to fold the regulators into those conversations. And I think ultimately, that's one of the roles that we would look to CISA to help sort of fill. And I think, there's great promise in the way that we're doing things, especially on the pipeline side, for instance, right now, to push that forward.
All right, well, we're almost to the end of our time. So thank you very much for being here and sharing your insights. And I'm going to have one more question, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us through this hour on what can be a dry topic, but I think was actually a somewhat lively conversation. I want to close the panel with just one kind of closing thought, which is, in your view, what is the biggest impediment to either complying with regulations or issuing regulations?
Cost recovery, and when we are asked to do impossible things or contradictory things, which can happen, though, to credit some regulators, when you communicate that, they become more flexible and they want to work with you to figure it out. But if you're asked to do something that doesn't make sense, like patching an endpoint in an operational system, doesn't make sense, it's very hard to comply. If you're asked to put multi-factor authentication on every field device, doesn't make sense, very hard to comply.
Yeah.
To credit the regulators, when you explain why, oftentimes it's a fruitful conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, largely the same thing, that balance of impact versus flexibility. Like from the security side, my vote would be lock it in a box, buried under 30 feet of concrete. It's secure. You can't run your business, but I'm a security person. So I think having all sides come to that table and understand there's some give and pull about how do we make this impactful without, making business operations impossible.
Final word, Kate.
I'll just add to that. I think the harmonization issue, right? So a lot of organizations today are multifaceted. They're covered by many different regulatory frameworks. And so we as a community need to make it as easy as possible for organizations to do compliance, not because it doesn't work or it's easy or it's ineffective, but just because they can direct the resources to true risk reduction and at the same time meet regulatory requirements as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sitting on the panel and talking about this hot button topic. Thanks again, audience, and round of applause for our panelists.
Get the fist bumps on the way out. Boom. But wait, there's more. I know. Go to the restroom. Take your time. Give them a couple of minutes. So you signed up on the escape room visa.
Oh, yeah.
Have you done it before?
What's that?
Have you done it before?
Not this one.
Oh, yeah. They really took it up another level. Oh, yeah? No, next week, yeah, I'm flying to Kansas on Monday, I'm speaking Wednesday morning. Energy Impact Partners Wednesday night. Oh, yeah, did you see my text? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I got asked, like, oh, you don't have, I'm sorry, sir. Yes, yeah, because I already, August. There you. You know that thing, landing in the airport, like going just all I know. Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah. I'm gonna go yell at people.
Hello.
Because we had a problem last time.
Questions for you.
Y'all are on, so just
All
so
right.
you know, but he'll mute you up there, so it's not
Okay.
like you don't have to talk. You okay with the wire in front, or do you want to go underneath your shirt?
You going on to that? All right. Yeah, I'll go through.
I did. Okay.
Hello.
Just turn this so you can see.
Is that,
Okay.
okay, I'll try not to move.
Just, yeah, right there.
Well, you're fine, and I'll boost it a little bit if you.
Okay, great.
Good to go?
VC perspectives on cybersecurity investing. As active investors in early stage cybersecurity companies in the critical infrastructure space, we'll discuss our views on current funding environment, the types of companies that are fit for venture capital, and our views and predictions on what's to come before opening the floor to questions. So when I design the schedule each year, I always try to think about what are some different perspectives for critical infrastructure, because we all come at it from a different angle. And two of the pieces that I really like each year is we do press perspective, because they are part of the solution and part of the problem. They are part of the education of the mainstream to understand what is happening. Same with the VC community. These are the folks who are investing in saying, this is an idea worth bringing to the market to help us. So with that, Hansel, our moderator. Yeah, no, up here on stage. I mean, you can do the panel from over there. You just won't, they won't get a good shot of you.
Awesome. Well, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Bryson. As you mentioned, we're all investors in cybersecurity. We focus on different stages and different theses, but I think, today will be a great panel. We have 3 more panelists today. We have Chris from Paladin Cyber, Gabby from First In, and John from Data Tribe, if you all want to come up. Sure. Cool. Well, I guess maybe just to kick things off, if each one wants to give a brief overview, some background about themselves, and maybe quickly talk about their firm, and then we can kind of jump in with questions.
Sure. Christopher Steed, I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Paladin Capital Group. Been with the firm now for 15 years. The firm was originally started in 2001 with a very discrete and specific investment thesis, is that the vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure, they are growing and they're growing exponentially. We need to find dual use products, services, and technologies in order to address those vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure, both at times of crisis and times of rest. As I said, the firm's been around since 2001. We're now on our 5th fund, and this most recent fund we did a final closing on last May. It's a $372 million fund that continues forward that original thesis against what was Homeland Security in 2001, 2002, to what we describe today as security in the cyber age.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Gabby Fong. I'm a senior associate at Firstin. Firstin is an early stage security technology venture capital firm. We focus in particular on cybersecurity, data intelligence, and automation, and dual use and defense tech. We're in what would be considered a little bit of the emerging fund category, having just finished the deployment out of our Fund 1. We now have 15 companies in our portfolio and are transitioning to investing out of our Fund 2. Our team is composed of almost entirely DoD and IC veterans, and we're really passionate about empowering entrepreneurs who secure our freedom. Really excited to share the stage with all of you today.
Right on. Hi, I'm John Funge, and I'm with Data Tribe. A little bit about me. I came to investing as an entrepreneur. So most of my career, I've been through the process of starting, building, and selling 3 companies. Been at Data Tribe for about 5 years, and I oversee our foundry, which kind of brings me to a little bit about Data Tribe. So we invest at seed stage, which is super early stage, and our thesis is centered around the general idea that the most sophisticated ideas in cyber, oftentimes coming out of the intelligence community and nation states, with the US being right there at the top. And so we are a little island of very hands-on Bay Area style investing that's plopped down in Maryland, right in the middle of what we like to think of as the Silicon Valley of cyber, which is this broader DC Baltimore ecosystem. We have a very unique way of engaging with our companies in that we have a co-build approach whereby we are very, very involved with working with our portfolio companies. And we have a team of people with a similar background as myself, a lot of founding and startup experience. Some of our portfolio companies, 18 portfolio companies. Dragos is one of our portfolio companies, which we're very proud of, and 17 others that are on a similar growth trajectory.
Nice. Hello, everyone. I'm Tansel Ismail. I'm with Energy Impact Partners. We're a $3 billion venture capital fund. We're primarily backed by electric utilities and big industrial conglomerates. Our core focus, we do 2 things. One of it being climate tech, and the other, which is cybersecurity. It's one of the theses we've been, aggressively going after in the last few years. We have about 14 companies in the space, and we generally come a little bit later. So we'll do A, but our sweet spot is mostly B, C, and D rounds. We're based out in New York, and most of the time, we'll be leading these rounds. And a lot of our LPs are, like I said, electric utilities. So think of, big companies like Southern, Xcel Energy, Duke Energy. And our value proposition is 1, we're providers of capital, and 2, we help our portfolio companies, the companies we invest in, find ways to also partners with all these large strategics that are kind of backing us and asking us to invest on their behalf. So with that being said, I think, we've all here in this panel been investing in cybersecurity for a various amount of years. We've seen the space evolve over time. And it would be just great to get, you guys' perspective on how the VC environment has evolved for cybersecurity specifically. I think, VC is an emerging category, and within that, cybersecurity specifically, it's much younger. I would say it probably got institutionalized maybe 10 years ago. And so, we've seen rapid progress over the last few years, and specifically, I would say these last 2 to 4 years, you've seen a lot of interest in cybersecurity specifically. So Chris, I think, you've been doing this for a while. How have you seen the cybersecurity investing landscape kind of evolved over these years?
I mean, it's really been an evolution. I mean, when we first did our initial cybersecurity investment back in 2002, the budgets for these types of products, services, and technologies, they were just a little sliver of the IT budget. It was nice to have. And now we have progressed from nice to have to need to have to you are mandated to absolutely have this. You can't do business either with the US government, foreign governments, large critical infrastructure operators unless you have that baseline of what you need in order to make yourself secure and then therefore those customers even more secure. And so the critical need of these technologies is only increasing. And the investment ecosystem, the government ecosystem, the private sector operators, that has now been brought to bear. And so as we look at how this market has evolved over the last 20 years, I mean, we have to acknowledge that at first, you know, that chief information security officer was sitting there, they were taking pitches from 15, 20, 30 companies a year. Now they're sitting through 400, 500 pitches a year, and they're pulling their hair out, trying to figure out the difference between A and Z. And so for so much of where this market is going, we now have critical mass. We need a whole lot more investment. We need a lot more counterparties that are going to come in and also participate right alongside like-minded investors like us. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge that for the most part, security is still seen as a cost center. You're not getting ROI on that. It's a pain. It's a huge, huge undertaking from a resource, a time, and a cost perspective. And so as we have evolved with this market, and I think you're right, it's about 10, 15 years ago when the market really started to shift, we are now seeing organizations look at cybersecurity as providing additional levels of ROI and then also finding those products, services, and technologies that could be sold to various different business divisions and operational priorities. You can't just be continuing to sell to the same Fortune 1000 chief information security officers again and again and again. There's a mid-market opportunity. There's market opportunities for small companies, foreign companies. And so for us, we think that there could not be a better time to be investing in this space than right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Chris, and just add, a few things there. One is for exactly all the reasons that Chris just mentioned. I think in the cybersecurity investing space, investors are feeling really confident about their ability to continue to invest in this space. And at relatively high valuations compared to the rest of the technology sector, where we've seen those valuations take a hit, where fundraising has slowed, investors and our limited partners are really excited about the opportunities that cybersecurity continues to present, both from a mission perspective of making the nation a safer place, our critical infrastructure safer, Department of Defense, et cetera, but also from a returns perspective.
Yeah, no, so I like to sometimes use the expression, you guys probably have heard the Andreessen Horowitz, this famous thing, software is eating the world. And I sometimes look at cyber a little bit like it's like the wake on the next to a speedboat, right? So you've got software eating the world, and right next to it, therefore cyber is eating the world. To kind of look at it in the last 10 years in terms of like some numbers, just to kind of give some perspective on the investing, over the last 10 years, the number of cybersecurity venture capital deals that have been done in the US and Europe has gone from roughly around 300 to 800. So it's kind of like 130, 140%. The amount of dollars has gone up like 7x, 700% from 2013 to 2022. And the average investment amount per round went from around $6 million to $20 million. And so the money is going up way faster than the number of deals. All of it's going up massively, as software continues to eat the world. But if you think about, like, in 2022, there's 800 plus venture investments just in the US and Europe. You do that for a few years and you start to arrive at the RSA show floor pretty quickly. Like you start to understand why the industry is so incredibly fragmented and noisy. There are thousands and thousands of companies. And the reasons there's thousands and thousands of companies is because it's a titanic problem and opportunity. It's a wonderful place to invest. And that's, there's a lot of reasons why it's a great place to invest. But the headline is that there's been a massive increase in the digitalization of the world in the last 10, 20 years. And right along with it is cybersecurity as a priority. And right along with it are investors following.
No, I agree. I think we've seen a very interesting evolution. I would say probably 10 years ago, there is maybe more entrepreneurs than venture capital dollars chasing cybersecurity. So if you're investing in the space, I think most people that invested earlier on, I think the returns were pretty good just because there is less competition among investors. And I think people kind of caught up to it maybe 2016, 2017. And I think that's where we kind of had an ideal balance where you had the right amount of entrepreneurs and the right amount of capital kind of chasing it. So valuations, I think, were pretty relatively, deals were fairly priced. We were seeing a good amount of exits. And then I think, things really got carried away during COVID.
21.
Interest rates went to zero. And so everybody started moving up the yield curve, right? If you can't make any money in bonds, people that invested in bonds went to equities. People that did equities, a lot of them started looking at private equity and venture capital. And all of a sudden you were in an environment where there was a lot of generalists, there's a lot of money, and people didn't know where to park it. And so there was more capital than entrepreneurs. And, entrepreneurship came at a premium. And so a lot of companies that were very early got a lot of money. And I think we still haven't seen it fully played out where, the expectations of the investors were high, but realistically, because you've only been doing this for a few years, you hadn't seen really the market play out. You didn't really understand cyber. You knew that it's a big thing and it's a big secular trend. And so I think, we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years, it's still a very big trend, but I think there's going to be a lot of investors that are going to be caught flat-footed just because they put too much money too fast in a lot of companies. And realistically, to build a big company, it takes 5 to 10 years, right? They don't happen in 2 to 3 years. And so I think a lot of people kind of lost the fundamentals. And now I think we're back to it. I think a lot of people that were just, we kind of call them tourist investors have kind of backed out, and people that really believe in the space are still actively investing. And I think it's healthier for everybody. I think it resets the expectations for a lot of companies. And also for us as investors, it allows us to find, pretty good opportunities to kind of deploy additional capital.
Well, Tansu, you bring something up, and Gabby, I would love to hear from you. It seems like the biggest beneficiary of all these tech layoffs and these engineers coming onto market are government organizations, particularly here, and then entrepreneurs that are coming out of those organizations wanting more capital. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this goes into some of our thought process on the types of entrepreneurs that we like to invest in, and the folks who have this DoD, IC government background, who gain this experience on the ground and kind of have encountered some of the friction points in government firsthand, are usually among some of the most passionate folks about solving those problems, and have been equipped with the skills to potentially go out and do that on their own as their own venture. And so we really like to see that in the entrepreneurs that we invest in, both that passion for the problem and then this deep technology experience and expertise that they can, we can trust that they can apply to that.
Yeah. And John, Data Tribe was set up to do just that. Let's catch them as they're coming out, start companies, let's bring that A-team, let's bring that knowledge to the broader market. Are you seeing more of an influx of entrepreneurs now wanting to do this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I would say overall the number of entrepreneurs and it's interesting because we sometimes look at it like ideas, and then there's teams, and then when an idea and a team come together, it's a deal. It's really good, right? And so so over half our portfolio is alumni from NSA, and then we have a few from the CIA, et cetera. And we love, our whole thesis is centered around this idea that that's really where the most advanced thinking is. And so we have noticed, and we actually, it's interesting, Chris, I would anticipate kind of, to some of the more recent trends, like if you think about the funding in the venture ecosystem, things really slowed down about, sort of early 2022. And that's when, and even if you look like the first quarter of 2022 to today, there's been almost like around a 50% deal volume drop. And so what's happened is it's gotten really a lot harder for startups to raise. And typically when we're really putting a check into a company, you're thinking about giving it a roughly, call it 18 to 24 months to kind of build up some milestones to get to that next stage of funding. if you go fast forward from, when the music sort of stopped at the beginning of 2022, that brings you to like the middle of this year. And so we would anticipate that there's going to be a lot of companies, really quality companies, that are going to have a harder time raising money later this year because they raised money when it was easy to raise money, and now it's gotten harder, the bar is higher. But yeah, the deal flow has been really high. Yeah. How about you?
We've seen the same thing, and the mission-based focus of those entrepreneurs that are coming out of these environments is not just refreshing, it's the type of stuff that we try to gravitate to. And we've come a long way with our investment strategy, and frankly, we're pretty pissed off that the adversary continues to be a step ahead. And the time for us to be afraid is done. It's time for them to be afraid, because there's more of us here that are doing good versus them that are doing bad. They just happen to have a louder loudspeaker right now. And so as more and more of these entrepreneurs come out, I think you're going to see a level of innovation that we really haven't seen in this space since its inception. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen a massive uptick in the level of spending, the level of entrepreneurship. But now, in this globalized world, in this hyper-connected ecosystem, we got to move past just trying to defend our networks and our systems and our devices. We got to defend people. It's time to create safe passage for people, for humans in cyberspace. And so, we have seen just a massive uptick in the type of quality assets that are coming to the table that have next-gen ideas. And they've worked with A players. Now they want to make money doing it as well.
Right on.
Oh, very interesting. And then I guess for the audience here, in terms of perspective, if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to go out and raise money, how should I think about the different types of VC investors out there, investing into cybersecurity? Sometimes it's geographically focused, sometimes it's stage focused, sometimes it's more of generalist. What do you guys kind of think, when you think about the landscape of people that are investing in cyber, where should people look if they want to raise capital?
Why don't you start?
Sure, yeah, would love to start, yeah. For First In, and I think with the others that are on the stage here, like, we really value or think that where we bring value is our experience in cybersecurity. A majority of our team has been on the ground, either building startups, from the ground up as operators, founding their own companies, or investing in the space for the while, some combination of those. And so we believe that in order to really to make the right investments in cybersecurity, you need to be able to understand the market, the landscape, where the technology is at now, and where it's headed. And that's a really complex problem that I think can sometimes be easily missed in maybe a more of a generalist perspective. It could be easy to kind of put a lot of money. And I think to your point, Tanzil, like, everyone's like, oh, cyber's the next thing. That's the next big thing. But to really pick the right companies, and especially for First In, where we focus on seed stage companies, and much like Data Tribe and others, we pride ourselves on being able to bring that expertise in order to hopefully pick some winners really early in the process, and then grow them to the stages where others can invest as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, the thing with cyber I've found, and I kind of, I did a bunch of stuff before I came to cyber, kind of fresh, bright-eyed, and fresh like 5 years ago. And most of my career I was in the trenches doing software development. I started my career as a software developer, so I'm fairly technical. Like, I'm comfortable around that stuff. But a couple of the things I could say about cybersecurity and my observations from it is it's a step more technical than a typical like enterprise SaaS kind of thing. It's this combination, like, you have to really understand the technology in order to defend it and to exploit it, right? So it's like computer engineering, it's big data, it's cryptography, it's network engineering, it's all these disciplines. It's very jargon filled. We had mentioned before, there's thousands of competitors out there, so you can pick, any kind of space, let's say some kind of zero trust thing, or data protection or whatever, and there's going to be like 20 or 50 companies to kind of grok, like, what's the difference between that and the startup. So it definitely is something where it's very helpful to have some specialization. And I also think the founders also appreciate that too. Like, when we talk with founders that have deep technical background, or come out of, and you're able to kind of really quickly understand and kind of track with them, I think that helps to really foster a kind of constructive relationship.
Yeah, same thing. It's when you show up not with the immediate, hey, are you raising money? Okay, you're not. Click. You go in with a thesis, you go in with a concept and a set of themes, and you have that conversation with folks around the table, and hopefully in an underfunded segment at that point when you're going in at seed, late seed, Series A, and you get through 19 conversations, you hear the same story again and again, then you get that 20th conversation that all of a sudden is different. That's where we then start to sprint. And so taking the time, 3 to 6 months in a non-competitive financing process to help them build a company, to help them better understand what are the key risks that are out there, how do we take our institutional knowledge from the last 20 years and put you in the right place for success. Because especially at the seed stage and the early stage, it's a huge, long road, and trying to, in a competitive financing process, determine whether this is somebody I want to get in bed with and develop a long-term 10+ year relationship with is really, really difficult. And so being mission-focused, thesis-driven, theme-driven, and then having that level of specialization, I think it goes over incredibly well at those early stages. And then at the same time, we also want those generalists to come in at those later stages as well. With huge amounts of money, huge amounts of funding that can bring these companies, not just from the scale that they currently have, but to global scale. There is no, cyberspace doesn't have a geography. This is a global problem. And so we do need that level of scale that comes with those traditional venture capitalists that are generalists. They have billions of dollars to put to work. Let's bring this solution of absolute critical need out to the rest of the world. And so, yeah, I'd agree that there's, really important level of specialization needed in order to get it right at that early stage and then try to de-risk it for those later stage investors that have been building businesses for decades and decades, going back basically to World War II. That's when venture capital really started, was funding veterans coming back from the field and trying to help them build businesses. Some of those companies that were funded in those years right after World War II are still alive today with hundreds of thousands of employees. And so you got to take the long-term view that this is not just a transaction. We're on a mission to build something for the long term.
No, I agree. And I think cybersecurity kind of went from being niche to mainstream. And so even at the very earlier stages, you can either, a lot of times if you want to raise capital, you can get funding from incubators, accelerators. Sometimes you'll have really successful ex-CEO or entrepreneurs in cybersecurity willing to fund you. And then as you hit more milestones, you can kind of go to seed, early stage investors. And these people will really kind of help you, take your product from something where you just probably have a few design partners and you're in the few $100,000 in revenue to kind of building out your sales team, scaling your marketing, really starting to look like a real business. And then once you get to there, there's a few milestones to hit, and then you can kind of unlock a new type of investors. And these are the types of investors that are going to come in, give you 10, 15, $20 million and really, kind of help you play out your thesis. Go global, maybe expand international, have a sales force that you can expand across the US. And then once you kind of prove that out, then there's another tier of investors, and they really kind of start giving you the big checks, 50 to 100 million. And those are the companies where, you're either on a path to an IPO or you're going to become an acquirer, right? You're going to become a consolidator yourself. And so I think just this depth of the capital markets is really helping a lot of cybersecurity entrepreneurs, execute on their vision. Whereas before, you kind of had to bootstrap your business to build something big.
I think I would add one thing to, if folks haven't, sort of dealt in, VC stuff before, one of the things that's really important is to understand the model of the people you're talking to, because not all VCs are the same in terms of for example, we invest principally at the seed stage, which is we're usually first institutional money in, whereas others might invest. I think, Pal, you guys are maybe a little later.
Late seed Series A is when we come in.
Yeah, so we'll typically put in like a $2 to $2.5 million check. What would be your typical check?
4 to 6.
Yeah.
On that initial entry point.
Yeah, and so you're looking at companies that are a little bit more mature, principally, not all the time, and Tansel, how about you guys?
At the low end, 15 to 20.
Right, right. So very different kind of company,
exactly.
Right? So with different valuations. And if you're talking to an investor and you don't really have a clear understanding of, okay, what is their model, it could just be sort of counterproductive. So it's really important to understand that there's these different types of models that are investing at different stages and have a different kind of investment size preference and things like that. And that's, seed, Series A, B, and so on. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I guess to that point, when you're looking at startups and entrepreneurs specifically, which kind of profiles either do you like to back, or which kind of entrepreneurs have you guys had the most success with in cybersecurity specifically?
Sprint towards the sound of gunfire. It's not easy building a business, and it's really difficult building a cybersecurity business. And so it's those types of entrepreneurs, regardless of the technology, the business model, the sales strategy, you're going to go out there and you're going to try to create something successful, and successful can be very broadly defined.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, at FirstIn, about half of our portfolio companies were founded by DoD or IC veterans. So we certainly see value in that. But I think the second piece, the second type of profile that we see, is that technologist who has encountered a problem, is really passionate about solving it, has the technological prowess to do it, and then either is self-aware enough to know that they probably are not best positioned to be the CEO, the person who's selling this, doing the operation side, or on the other hand, has those skills as well. Just really having a founder who's self-aware about what their capabilities and limitations are, because as Chris mentioned, this is a long-term endeavor that relationship that you're entering into, and so knowing that the person that you're partnering with in that venture has the awareness to peel apart their gaps and help fill them with the right people is really important.
Yeah, self-awareness is really good. That's a really good point. We spend a lot of time, particularly super early stage. Like if you're investing in a later stage company, there's a lot of meat on the bone. So like if you happen to have a problem with somebody on the team, like it's not going to fall apart. But like at seed stage, if the founder doesn't work out, like you're probably going to go to zero with the whole effort. And so it's really important. And one of the things kind of, building on this point about self-awareness is this idea that like founders kind of need to strike this balance between being coachable, but also being confident. It's this kind of like, you don't want to have somebody that just does everything you say, because God knows what we say is often not right. But you want somebody that actually listens and kind of synthesizes it with the other things that they're getting told by other people, which is this. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what that is. I think self-awareness is a big part of it, but this combination of coachability and confidence with domain mastery in something, and ideally they've kind of gone through the startup grinder before, but oftentimes they haven't. That's fine too. A lot of stuff. Anyway, it's a huge question.
No, but I completely agree. I think from my experience, it's never a straight line. Even the most successful companies, there's always road bumps in the middle. And so I think what you kind of have to determine is this somebody I can partner with? And a very important thing is, can this person be reasoned with? Because there's some people, they're so stubborn, even if you prove them wrong, they're not going to change their mind. Whereas the best entrepreneurs, they realize they don't know everything. And like you said, it's important to have conviction, but it's also, I think, have enough self-awareness to when the data doesn't agree with what you think, to be able to pivot. And I think in the long term, those are the best types of entrepreneurs, because it's never easy building a startup, and we've seen it many times. And in terms of profiles we like to see, I think a lot of times, just because it's cybersecurity, a lot of these people would have worked for the government. Sometimes you have people that worked at large enterprises like a Cisco or RSA, and they've been developing enterprise-grade products for 20 years, and they think they want to capture more of their upside themselves, and so they kind of spin out on their own. And then there's a third type, which we don't really like, is just people chasing the heat. Like for example, with cloud security, all of a sudden, everybody became a self-proclaimed cloud security expert and had a startup in the space. And maybe that works to get you 5, 10 customers because it's relationship-based. But over the long terms, I think those types of businesses, it's very tough to succeed and build something that's really enduring. And I guess, going off that point, from your guys' perspective, a lot of people start companies and try to address some cybersecurity problems, but not every cybersecurity company is fit for venture capital. So when you guys kind of look at companies, in your opinion, which types of companies are fit to raise venture capital?
I start off. Yeah, so we have this it's a little bit of a metaphor that we sometimes say. There's like one of the things I personally love, having kind of gone through the whole startup process a few times, is that there is no right path to doing a company, right? Like for every person, there's a different kind of entrepreneurial journey, and the DC Baltimore ecosystem actually has a tremendous amount of entrepreneurship on the order of that in the Bay Area. However, a lot of that entrepreneurship is consulting and systems integration, and so having a consulting firm that services a federal customer and maybe grow it to 50 to 100 people, where you own 80% of it and sell it to Raytheon, that's a wonderful entrepreneurial journey. It's an amazing way to make a huge amount of money. However, it's not a fit for venture capital. And so we sort of describe that path. At DataTribe, we describe it as baseball. Basketball, they're both sports, and you've got athletes involved. Basketball is just a different game. And the game of venture capital is very much this sort of, the kind of classic Bay Area where you're trying to, you pick an idea that's ideally massive, that could have a multi-billion-dollar, huge addressable market. You're creating a repeatable product, and because you're creating a product, you have to hire a bunch of developers and things ahead of time. So you need money. So you raise capital to do that, and then you grow, and you basically kind of make it through these different funding milestones. You might raise over the course of the company, if you don't get acquired, maybe $50 to $100 million, leading to hopefully some great exit, which could be in an M&A event to a strategic acquirer, or even an IPO if you go all the way. That's kind of the game of basketball. Both are entrepreneurship. Both are incredible ways to kind of conduct a career and potentially make a lot of money. But if you are talking to venture investors, you have to understand that they play basketball.
I think that's a really great point, John, for entrepreneurs to understand just the incentives, and how venture capitalists are thinking about it. And so, for us, we're looking, like John mentioned, for a product company that really has the ability to scale quickly, that has is solving a problem that enterprises are experiencing at large levels, that hasn't already been uniquely solved by someone else. And I think this is where the specialization can really help, right? When you're looking at a cybersecurity company or a handful, day after day after day after day, and you're familiar with the market and the technology piece, as an investor, it's a lot easier to at least try and find where somebody might be addressing a problem that hasn't already been addressed in these thousands of companies that are existing to try and tackle the cybersecurity problem. So yeah, those are the types of companies we're looking at. And occasionally we do invest in a company where maybe the market segment is smaller now, but we project that it will be growing a lot in the future. And so that's maybe a little bit of our exception, but very aligned. John, agreed.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And when it comes to venture capital, I mean, we are an asset class, and we are a part of the alternative investment asset class, and a relatively small part of that asset class, which means we really need to outperform. And so we're looking for huge market opportunities. And so every new time we see digital innovation begin to take hold, whether it's cloud, mobile, AI is now coming fast down the path, we're looking for those types of opportunities, because we just have to. We can't invest in the best encryption technology that has ever been created that has one single customer inside of the federal government and can only be sold to that customer once. Yeah, maybe the best technology in the world, but that's not 90% gross margins. That's not easy path to profitability. That's not massive levels of scalability. Now, we're always looking for those levels of innovation where we can try to bring to the broad commercialization scheme, but that is really, really hard. And so, when it comes to, and John, you said it earlier, you got to know your counterparty. I mean, who are you dealing with? And for most venture capitalists, I mean, we have to create outsized returns, or the money's going to go to bulge brackets. It's going to go to other specialists. It's going to go to generalists. And so we've got to show our wares by having that level of sophistication to understand, hey, even if this company fails, relatively so, if they're still going after that broad market opportunity, there's probably going to be folks that acquire them. And so we may not be returning 10x our money, but even 50 cents on the dollar or $1 on the dollar, when you're looking at a venture capital portfolio, that's the expectation that we have to go into this, because of the amount of risk that we're taking. About a third of a portfolio out of 30 companies, 10 of those companies just not going to make it. And we're never going in and hoping, okay, this company is the one that's going to make it. This is the one that's probably not going to make it. We're hopeful across the board for all of them. But at the end of the day, we still have The buck doesn't stop with us. We've got our investors to answer to, and if we're not chasing those types of opportunities, we're frankly not taking enough risk and therefore not doing our job.
I agree, and I think for us, probably the most important thing too, is the addressable market. Like, how big is the market you're going after? Because I think we're in the business of kind of hitting home runs. And when you think about those two markets, I think there's two of them. There's one where sometimes it's just like a brand new market. So, for example, OT cybersecurity, and there it's all about timing. Because sometimes you can be right, but if you're right too early before people are ready to buy, it's almost the same thing as being wrong. Or sometimes it's somebody has a really good approach to an existing problem. And so in those cases, you have to displace incumbents. And so it needs to be either two things. Either the value proposition needs to be 10 times better than what exists already to convince somebody to switch, or it needs to be kind of 10 times cheaper or even 5 times cheaper than the existing solution where the ROI is clear. And I think when you can kind of align on those, because we've seen sometimes, even if the execution of the business is not perfect, the market is just so big that you have 3 to 5 winners. Whereas if it's the other way around, if the market is really small, then you kind of need perfect execution, and there's probably only room for 1 or 2 winners max. And so us as venture capitalists, and it's always tough to tell, right? Because you're predicting the future. What's really important for us, it's kind of the addressable market, and then everything else falls into place accordingly.
So I'm curious, so when you're just kind of talking about the different stages, right? So you guys are working at a later stage than we are. So, for you guys, an outcome, an exit, like if you're putting a $15 million check, right, to work, what are you expecting down the line? And so like, what kind of exit does that company need to have relative to a $2 million check, and what we're expecting, what we would need? Can you kind of just comment a little bit?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, so for a $15 million check, for example, in our heads, we said, can we at least generate $50 to $75 million in gross proceeds from that?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're owning 10 to 15%, you're already looking at $750 million to $1 billion exit, right? So in those scenarios, I think it needs to be a big company, it needs to be a large market.
Right.
And the large markets, usually there's 3 to 5 winners, I would say. For example, like endpoint security, maybe the firewalls. And then sometimes, you'll get lucky. And now I would say, before it was really impressive for people to invest in unicorns. I think now the new bar, it's a decacorn, right? And so sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find these decacorns. But for us, we believe this is going to be a platform business, because these are the ones that really fetch the valuations. And actually, you can monetize those investments. Because a lot of times also, companies will reach these valuations, but at the end of the day, maybe they won't grow into it or something, and you can't monetize this investment. So I think we're really looking for large markets. And we realize too that for these large markets to play out, sometimes it's just going to take longer than you expect. And most cases, to build an enduring company, it takes you 10 to 14 years, even though people think they can get there in 5 to 7.
So right, so that's like really rare air, right? Like you actually just quantified the scale of the business, that the outcome, right? So like cyber companies that get up to be $1 billion plus in value, like if you look at like a pipeline of them, I mean, that's a very small percentage of the ones that start out. Now for us, like if we put $2 million in, of course we want that. I mean, we want 100x, 200x return if we can get that on that. However, for an earlier stage investor, you can have a company exit at $200 million and it's still a wonderful return. And so there's a very different kind of dynamic depending upon when investors, which you can sometimes see this around a board table, because you might have investors that came in a later stage and earlier stage, and their interests can kind of diverge in terms of the outcomes. And that happens with the founders too. I mean, a $50 million acquisition or something for a founder might be a wonderful $10 million payday. For them, amazing. But for the investors, it's not so great. And so there's a little bit of a tension, can be.
It's a great point. It's a great point. I mean, the vast majority of venture-backed companies exit below $50 million. And that's just across the board. Now, the vast majority of successful venture-backed exits exit between $250 and $500 million. I mean, the rare air of a $1 billion company. And then you got to look at how much can the market really consume in terms of $1 billion cybersecurity startups. And so if every investment you're making, you're hoping for that IPO, probably not getting there.
No, I agree. But at the end of the day, it's a numbers game, right? So you only really need 1 or 2 out of 20 investments to kind of even, do 3, 4, 5x as a fund. And so as venture investors, it's not always going to play out, but, you have to think, is there a possibility that we achieve this, for us specifically, this decacorn outcome And it's very hard, but when it works, it works.
Yeah.
That's kind of the game we're playing.
Gabby, what's your preferred check size?
We're for our fund two, we'll be leading seed stage rounds with 1 to 2 million.
Got it. Okay. All right, cool.
Sounds good. I mean, start with you, then here.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Passing it down.
Got the whole, yeah.
And I would add maybe one that's interesting for the audience. Us as venture investors, when we look at these companies, how are we valuing them? Because a lot of times, they don't have a lot of revenue, they're burning a lot of money. And so how do we kind of come up with a valuation? And what do we, what are our methodologies? What are the approaches?
Yeah, I mean, so, I mean, honestly, guys, it's early stage, it's artwork. I mean, it's like, Kentucky windage, but there is a little bit more than that. I mean, so there's a couple drivers. One of the things we'll do, like if we don't, just kind of to get a grok of the kind of the market, we'll look at a PitchBook. PitchBook is awesome. If you don't, I don't know if you guys have ever used the thing's amazing. It's a really useful database of kind of deal data. Look at the last 12 months of cyber deals at seed stage and kind of look at some ranges, get a range of valuations and medians just to kind of get a little sense of the ambient market. Now that's certainly not gospel, and there's lots of variance, based on what you're doing, the founding team, maybe the geography, a bunch of things. Like typically deals on the West Coast are kind of inflated. You could have super celebrity, experienced founders that somehow get like a $50 million like a $50 million raise in their seed round or something like crazy. But also another key factor, and I mean, I'd love you guys to talk about this, is that investors are, when we're making an investment, we're also looking, like it's really important, like we have this kind of model and we're looking to usually own a certain percentage of the company after we make the investment. And so, if we're looking to own 25 or 30% of the business after the investment, then the plug number might be the valuation. If we think you need $2 million and we want to own 25%, then you just arrive at a valuation number like that. And that's I think the way it happens a lot, especially at early stage. But how about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, that's how it works for us too, and you said it exactly. Valuation is more of an art than a science, especially at that early stage. And then you look back over the last 10, 15 years, those early stage valuations, late seed Series A, have relatively remained unchanged. I mean, it's between $15 and $25 million pre-money. Even in the environment that was 2020 and 2021, where valuations were extremely high and tracking against public company multiples that were also really high. That math really hasn't changed. And so to your point, I mean, for us, when we're getting in, we want to use $4 to $6 million to buy 20% of this company. And that equates to that valuation range for us, that $15 to $25 million pre-money. I mean, what about you guys?
Yeah. Math is the same. And I think, it's really interesting, for us as a firm, for our fund one, our average check size was $500K, and we followed in rounds. And one of the reasons why we felt really convicted about moving in our fund two to leading stage rounds is so that our sweat equity and our value proposition that we think we bring with our full-time team and our extended team of operating partners really matches with our actual equity in the company. Because as I think we've alluded to here, seed stage, early stage companies they're risky. It's a lot of work to build up an idea from maybe a little bit of revenue, a little bit of traction, to growing it into, a decacorn, that would be great. Or, $500 million company would be great too, So I think all of those things are really interesting when you think about incentives for VCs and just important for everyone to keep in mind. But yeah, looking to use our $1 to $2 million checks for 10 to 15% ownership. So.
Yeah. So I imagine you guys is probably a little bit more comps driven and
yeah,
it's a little bit more mature. So it's
no, yeah. So we kind of look at it the other way around. In my head, I say, what's the possible range of outcome for this business, right? Does it sell for 150, 250, 350? And then, we're targeting 3x minimum. And so I'm going to back off to that, right? I'm saying if your next round is my exit, what's the proper valuation I'm willing to pay today? And what is the check size that I think this business can absorb? And so we kind of backs off that way, because I understand, at the earlier stages, the failure rate is much more high. You're much more focused on ownership because it's your winners that are going to carry everything.
Yeah.
Whereas us, I think a lot of the times we'll just hit a lot of singles and doubles. And from time to time, maybe every fund or every other fund, you'll have a really huge return that will skew everything. But I think for us, it's more important to make sure we're not losing money than making sure, we hit a 15, 20, 30x investment every fund. So I think it varies by stage too. And I think the other interesting thing too now, right, in this environment, valuations have come down a lot. I think people got carried away. A lot of companies with no revenue were raising at really high valuations. And I think now people have kind of come back down to earth because they realize, either A, they haven't kind of executed according to expectations, or B, you can't get acquired if, you raise your A at $100 million, because your acquirer will never pay that price, or, never pay enough of a price to kind of, compensate the investors for the risk. We have about 5 minutes left. So I guess, just let's focus the last part of the conversation on maybe predictions. And one thing I would think interesting is, talking about big outcomes, next product categories, in your opinions, where do you think either the next decacorn will come from in cybersecurity? I think we haven't seen one minted since SentinelOne got public since SentinelOne went public in the IPO. So in your opinion, where will the next decacorn come from?
I don't know where the next decacorn will come from, but as we started here, talking about the evolution of cyber, it's continuing to evolve. And when we talk about security in the cyber age, it's got 3 core value propositions, and we've now added a 4th. And so those first 3, it's about digital enablement. Every organization, large, small, commercial, government, they're adopting digital at an exponential rate in any which way, shape, and form. They got to think about security from the ground up. And for some, that's security by design. For most, it's design what you need, but have security, safety, trust in mind. So that's where it starts. Second, it's about monitoring and management. Can't defend, make resilient, or make efficient or scalable what you can't see. And so you must have persistent and contextual situational awareness over your internal and external network, physical, and human environments. Then third, cybersecurity. If you've gone through those first 2 stages of risk-managed digital adoption in the right way, cybersecurity is now more of an ROI equation than simply just a cost center. You're defending the entire business proposition as a whole. And now our new area, which we've now started to invest in, we've got 3 or 4 areas, is what we describe as cyber safety. How do you create safe passage for humans in cyberspace? That often gets vastly overlooked. And what we focus on there is the concept that the only way we get to a place where you start to see less conflict in cyberspace is by way of things like the presence of justice and the presence of those types of tools that can be used, not just with the private sector and the public sector, but by individuals themselves to be able to also protect themselves. You've got an issue right now, a national crisis, where you've got 10 to 17-year-olds in our country that are vastly more depressed than any generation before because of overexposure to online harm. You got 10 and 11-year-olds that are hanging themselves from the top bunks of their bunk beds because of overexposure to these types of things. And cybersecurity itself, very, very important, but we've got to take that next step forward. And so where we think the future is going, cyber safety, focused on safety tech, trying to create that safe passage for human in cyberspace. Because again, peace and safety and stability in cyberspace, it's not just by way of an absence of conflict, it's also by way of the presence of justice. And when you look at the snake malware that just got taken down, that was a multi-agency effort, also bringing in the Department of Justice and then also bringing in the private sector in order to shut down what was a 2-decade operation across 50 different countries. That's where we need to go. They need to be afraid. Those individuals need to be afraid if they're going to try to do something that is going to take advantage of an entire generation of individuals that are doing something good in this space. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, for sharing. I think, at the center of what you're saying is it's about people and about mission. And I think, security is meaningful to all of us, here on the stage. And for us, I think where people intersects really nicely with cybersecurity and the potential for the future is in OT security, right? So, the ability for unsecure OT to negatively impact people, or worse, have catastrophic impacts can be really high. And what I think is really interesting and exciting about OT security as compared to IT cybersecurity, which is traditionally a cost center, is that in securing OT, you can, of course, make that product safer to use and hopefully free from from threats and bad actors, but also potentially leverage data that is gained from monitoring this OT to either enable businesses to add additional features that create value, or in the case of government customers, enhance performance, like for the DoD. One of our portfolio companies is doing exactly this. It's called Shift5, and they are securing the DoD's vehicles, planes, trains, tanks, and weapon systems, and then leveraging that data to help the DoD ensure that it's getting the best performance for this really important equipment that helps us, keep the nation safe and our service members safe. So.
Right on. I'm going to actually pivot right off that because so very succinctly answer your question. I get self-interested. I do think maybe not the next, but a decacorn will be Dragos. So Dragos, one of our portfolio companies, very proud. They did a very significant D round. I think we view it. I mean, I think others maybe too, but they are a generational company. I mean, they're like a CrowdStrike, and they will eventually go public, and they will continue on and be incredibly big, successful company. I think in this last quarter, if I'm not mistaken, Wiz topped 10 billion.
Yeah.
They had which unbelievable. This company did their first round of financing in 2020, and just now, like 3 years later, they just did a $10 billion pre-money valuation. That's sort of a cloud security company, but. Observation. So at the RSA trade show, there's this sandbox competition, which is a pretty competitive startup competition, and a lot of companies apply to it. In the top 10, it's always interesting to see who are in the top 10. 6 of the top 10 companies at the RSA sandbox this year were application security companies. In Q1, the Biden cybersecurity strategy had this very provocative idea of shifting liability to the makers of software away from the customers. I personally, and DataTribe, I would say in general, we're pretty excited about, and we've done things in AppSec before. We think that we're nowhere near done with making the process of building software from soup to nuts much more secure so that people can use whatever it is that's coming out of that speedboat that's like, skimming across the ocean, and use it with a lot more confidence, knowing that it's secure. So I would sort of say that broadly, there will be 1 or 2 big companies that come out of that space.
No, I agree as well. I think historically the biggest product categories have been firewall, identity, and endpoint. And I think the next big ones, it's either going to be cloud, like you said, OT cybersecurity, maybe something in SMB. I think we've seen companies get close, but not yet.
Huge market, hard to get to it.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of churn. It doesn't appeal to a lot of investors, but I think increasingly, if hackers start monetizing that avenue more, I think it's going to garner much more interest. Cool. Well, with that being said, thank you all for taking the time today. It was a great conversation, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
You get fist bumps on the way out. So we are now breaking for lunch. Tracks T1 and through 3 will be starting back up at 2 o'clock. But track 4, the villages, are available during lunch. This is a great chance to go and check out the villages. Biohacking Village, Aerospace Village. Everyone to learn how to pick a lock. You got to do that. It's all here.